So when we talk about real estate, which we started on Monday, just what we did there was just the very basics of what is real property. We talked about fixtures, and we talked about what the difference was between a fixture and personal property. We talked about that fancy word appurtenances. Y'all remember that word that we mentioned on Monday, and said that an appurtenance is any physical thing like a structure that's attached to the property, that runs with the land, that stays with the land itself, but it's also any of those sort of rights that belong to the land. Like if I own waterfront property, I have the right to access the water, not because I own the right to access water, but because the right to access the water belongs to what? What does the right to access the water actually belong to? Help me out.
The land.
It belongs to the land, right? It belongs to the property. It belongs to the land. I think they might not be able to talk.
Oh,
there we go. Now they can. Sorry about that. It belongs to the land itself. And so when you look at that word appurtenance, we're talking about those things that transfer with the land from owner to owner to owner. Now we want to get into what does ownership of this thing, this real property, actually look like. That's what section 2.2 is all about. And we're going to talk a little bit about rentals as well, but 90% of what we're going to talk about in this section deals with different forms of ownership. Big vocabulary word here. Not quite as important as the word appurtenance that we talked about on Monday, but a big vocabulary word that you're going to see a lot of in this class, simply the word estate. What is an estate? First of all, it's not one of the 50 things that make up the United States of America. I cannot tell you how often people make that mistake, and it drives me batty crazy. Don't send me an email that says I lived in another estate. No, those are states. There's no E on the front of that word. Those are states, the United States of America. That is different than an estate. An estate is an idea. It's a relationship. For example, like quick show of hands, how many of you are married? How many of you are married? Okay. If you're married, you have an estate with your spouse. The type of estate you have with your spouse is you're married to them. Does that make sense for everybody? The estate is the relationship. Your estate to your spouse is that you're married to them. All right, quick show of hands. How many of you are not married but have a significant other? You date somebody, you have a significant other, right?
Molly, Grant.
Well, you don't have to name them. You got to like put them on out there. If you are dating someone and you have a significant other, you also have an estate in that person because you have a relationship with that person. Here's the thing though, is it the same estate that the married people have with their spouse, or is it a different relationship? What do y'all think?
Different, right? Definitely different. That's me.
Very different.
Very different.
Yes. Very different. So an estate is just the type of relationship that somebody has to a piece of property. Like when we see somebody together out to dinner, our natural question that we ask them is, oh, are y'all married? Because we want to know what the relationship is between those people.
Just nosy.
We're nosy. We want to know, okay, we see two people, we see that they're together, but what's their relationship to each other? Well, guess what? We're nosy in the same way when it comes to real property or real estate as well. Here's the thing. If I see somebody living in a property, I know they have an estate in that property. Does that make sense for everybody? Here's how I know they have an estate in that property. They're there. They live there. They have a relationship to that property. But the thing is, I don't know what that relationship is. what are the two main relationships that pop to mind that person could have to that property? If you just saw somebody and you said, okay, this person lives in this property. If I looked at Eliza and I say, okay, she lives in that property that I'm looking at her on right now. She lives there. That's a relationship. What's the natural question that comes to mind?
That she owns or
Own
rents
or
it.
rent it.
There you go. Does she own it or does she rent it? What we're really asking there, and I know I'm spending a lot of time defining this, but I find it's a word that you got to kind of turn around the right way in your brain. When I ask if she owns it or rents it, folks, the fancy legal way of saying that is I'm asking her, what is your estate in that property? So now, here's what I want you to understand. Most of you probably would not have understood this question this morning. Sierra, what's your estate in that property that you're sitting in right now? Most of you all probably would not have understood that question. Do you understand what I'm asking her now when I ask her that question? When I ask her, Sierra, what's your estate in that property? What am I actually asking her?
What's your relationship to it?
The relationship
You
with
own
it.
What's your relationship to it? Mainly, do you own it or do you rent it? That's really what the question is. Does everybody now understand what that word estate means? Right? It's just the fancy legal way to describe the relationship somebody has in a property. So the owner of a piece of real estate has an estate in that property, but a tenant also has an estate. It's just a different type of estate. It's not the same one. And that's okay. What we're going to do in this section is we're going to work through and talk about these different types of estates and how we might have different levels or different relationships with people. And so we want to make sure that we're taking a look at all the different possibilities. How do we all feel about that word? Pretty good? Okay, good. I see a lot of thumbs up. That's good. So there are really two main categories of estates, which we just mentioned. Are you the owner of this piece of real property, or are you a tenant in this piece of real property? Well, like everything else in this class, we have to have more complicated legal terminology to refer to these things. We very rarely will, in legal terms, use the simplest words possible. And so therefore on the test, they're not going to use the simplest words possible. They're probably never going to say to you on the test that Molly owns the piece of property. What they will say is that Molly has a freehold estate in the property. Molly has a freehold interest in the property. Molly's relationship to the property is freehold. Look at what it tells you there on the slide freehold means. What's the very simple translation to the fancy word freehold? If I say Molly has a freehold interest, then Molly what?
Owns it.
She owns the property. It would be appropriate to say that Leslie has a freehold interest in the home in which she resides, because Leslie has an ownership interest. Now, that does not mean that Leslie is the only owner. We don't know how many there might be, but we know that of the owners, Leslie is one. Her relationship to the property is that she is an owner of the property. She has a freehold interest. Okay. Then the flip side of that, it would be appropriate to say that Seth has a non-freehold interest in the home in which he resides, which is just the fancy legal terminology for he does not own it. He has a legal interest in it. In fact, we know what his legal interest is. He is a tenant there. But so anybody who has a legal relationship to a property, but they are not the owner of the property, has a non-freehold interest. You want me to blow your mind just a little bit right here?
No, just kidding.
Any of you that you know of stand to inherit property? Like, you know for a fact that there's a will somewhere, that there's real estate involved, that you will inherit that real estate at some. I see Trisha's hand.
There better be one from my daddy, because I've been putting up with him for 30-some years.
Right. So those of you that just raised your hand, you already have a legal estate in that property. You already have a legal relationship to the property. Now, it's a very weak one because it could be changed, because that person could change their will before they die. But as of this moment right now, because somewhere there is a document that says if the current owner dies, you will become the new owner. That is a legal relationship that you already have to that property. So now here's a test question. That relationship, is that relationship right now that Trisha has to that property right now that she will inherit at some point in the future? Does she have a freehold interest in that property right now? Or does she have a non-freehold interest in that property right now?
Non-freehold.
Non-freehold.
She has a non-freehold interest in that property right now because she has a legal relationship to the property, but she does not what?
Own it.
She does not own it right
Yeah.
now. Now, is her non-freehold interest going to turn into a freehold interest at some point when she actually inherits the property?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. So at some point, she will go from non-freehold to freehold. But right now, her current legal relationship to the property is a non-freehold. Does that make sense for everybody?
It does.
Okay. Now, there are plenty of properties out there that we don't have any estate at all in. I have no legal relationship at all to my neighbor's house. None. So I don't have either a freehold interest or a non-freehold interest. But I have a freehold interest in my own house. I have a non-freehold interest in our family farm in Edgecombe County because I stand to inherit it at some point in the future. My mom currently has the freehold interest. I have a non-freeholder. Is that clicking for everybody? How do we all feel about that? Pretty good? And because those are important vocabulary words. Now, we really want to zero in for the most part in this chapter, in this section, on those freehold interests, which, remind me again, are we talking about the ones where the relationship is ownership or where it's non-ownership when we talk about freehold?
Ownership.
Ownership, okay? This is probably going to come as a surprise to you. Some forms of ownership are inheritable, and some forms of ownership are not inheritable. Believe it or not, there are ways in which somebody can own a property but be prevented from allowing their heirs to inherit the property from them. Their ownership essentially ends with them. They cannot choose what happens to the property after they own it. Now, that's very uncommon. Which one do you think is more common of these? Fee ownership or non-fee ownership? Which one do you think is going to be more common?
B.
Much more common, because you probably never even heard of a situation. Be honest. How many of you have ever heard of a situation where somebody owned the property, but they could not leave it to whoever they wanted to when they died?
Never.
No, that's very rare.
Well, I watched the videos.
But it is possible. It is possible. It is absolutely. Here, let me give you an example of that. Let's say, we'll talk about Leslie because she mentioned that she had to put up with her dad, so she better inherit his property.
I love my daddy, but gosh.
Well, but let's say her dad does give her the property. Now, let me ask y'all a question. While her dad is the owner, can he place any restrictions he wants to on that property while he's the owner?
Yes.
Yes. And how long will those restrictions stay attached to the property if an owner attaches them? That word appurtenance, it's appurtenant. What does that mean?
Until they don't own it anymore.
Forever.
Not until they don't own it anymore, but forever. Those restrictions become
Never go away. Ever, 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 ever.
never go away. Well, let me just throw this out there. Could Leslie's daddy give her the property with the restriction that she's not allowed to leave it as an inheritance for her children?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure could.
Yes.
Now, some people say, well, why would he want to? Stop being so nosy. That's not your job. It's not our job to figure out why people do the things they do. Maybe he doesn't like his grandkids. Maybe he thinks they're spoiled. maybe he thinks, just maybe he's got other kids somewhere that Leslie doesn't even know about that are way like 30 years younger than her. And he wants to make sure those kids get the property after Leslie dies, not her kids. Could he set that up that way if he wanted to right now?
It's his property. He can do whatever he wants with it.
He can do whatever he wants with it, right? There's all kinds of possibilities out there. So what I want you to do is kind of open your mind.
And one quick thing, Travis, that really stuck with me from our last class is that you had mentioned if somebody's going to put a restriction on real property, it could be as simple as whoever buys this property from the next owner forward, it has to say a red door.
Yes.
That would be an appurtenance forever.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
That's as simple as I could try to relate.
Well, there you go. All of these restrictions all go back to the same thing. The owner of the property can place any restriction they want to on the property. And once it's there, it's there. So if the current owner says the next owner can't leave this as an inheritance, do we have a fee ownership at that point, or do we have a non-fee ownership at that point?
Non-fee.
We have a non-fee, but it is much more common for the current owner to not care what happens once it. Can we be honest and say that most people, when they're transferring ownership of real estate, just don't give a crap what happens to it in the future?
Yes.
Right? They don't care. They don't care. And so most people, when they transfer, when I bought my house, I'm pretty sure the woman I bought my house from does not give a rip what I do with the house, who I sell it to, who I leave it to. As long as she got her money, she's gone, correct?
Yep.
Correct.
So do you think she transferred me fee ownership or non-fee ownership? Which one?
See?
Fee. And here's the truth. I wouldn't have paid her for the thing if she insisted on transferring me non-fee ownership, because she can control what she gives me, but I can control what I give her. And I gave her money in exchange for this property. And if she had said to me, oh, I'll sell you the property, but you can't leave it to your heirs, I would be like, please, that ain't gonna work for me.
So I think, Travis, a lot of times we see these non-fee, estates when it comes to family, passing on land to family members, because that's kind of the only time that you can put a restriction on whoever else is going to own the property. Otherwise, as you said, who's going to buy it from you?
Well, that's it. It deals with weird situations. It's a very odd situation, right?
Great question, Tyler.
Tyler asked a fantastic question. If the previous owner makes an appurtenance you don't like, can the next owner create an appurtenance that counteracts it? And the answer is no. So I like to think of it this way. You can always layer on more restrictions, but you can't take the previous ones away.
Right.
And you can't add restrictions that essentially overwrite the previous restrictions. So what you can do is make it worse, but never better.
Right.
If somebody, so for example, if somebody put a restriction on the property that said the door has to be red, the next owner could determine what shade of red, but they couldn't say the door could be blue because they can't write a restriction that violates the previous restriction. That's a really great question. Okay. So the question, and I'm going to have to ask how to pronounce, is it Shalaka? Is that right?
Shalika.
Shalika. Okay. I just want to make sure I got it right. Shalika asks, what can happen if you do something contrary to the appurtenances on your property? So that depends on the situation. Most likely, you get sued by the other people who are subject to the same restrictions, because very rarely are these restrictions placed on only one property. They're usually placed on a group of properties together, known as a subdivision. Very often that happens. And when you do that, the other people who are subject to the same restrictions have the right to take you to court and force you to comply with those restrictions. So that's a good question. But you could actually lose ownership of the property depending on what the restrictions are. Yeah. If it's just the one single property, you could actually have somebody take you to court, sue you to lose ownership of the property. That is absolutely possible. Okay.
Crystal kind of points out something that you might comment on.
Yeah, Crystal said if it's just the one and the person is dead, the only person who cares is dead, then you won't get sued. That's a valid point. If the one person who placed the restriction there is the only one who cares about the restriction and they're dead, well, obviously they're not going to know about it and they might not sue.
Well, what about their heirs?
But that's exactly right. Their heirs might care, because if they had the right to sue you, that means their children and their grandchildren have the right to sue you. So if their grandchildren 50 years later figure out that you're violating this covenant that granddaddy placed on the property, they might sue you and end up with the property back from you.
Yep.
So it's very important to understand these restrictions do last forever. Okay. So what about when you go to sell? Is the appurtenance still there? Yes, that is a question. That's a wonderful question, but that should be a self-evident question. What is the definition of an appurtenance, folks? How long does an appurtenance stay with the land?
Forever.
Forever. And that is the key connection to make, that once that's
Forever.
there.
And it's forever regardless of who owns the property.
That's right.
So, if I own it and there's a restriction, whoever owns it after me will own the property with the restriction.
Because when they took ownership subject to the restrictions that were already in place. Those restrictions were already
Excuse
there.
me, my question was more about, so if the one person dies, right? And then you just can go ahead and flaunt, and not adhere to the restriction unless somebody sues you, then you still can't sell the property because the appurtenance is still there. So,
Right, the next person still has to be willing to accept that restriction. Now, whether they follow the restriction or not is their choice, but they have to be willing to accept the restriction and accept the potential ramifications of not following that restriction.
I got it. Okay.
So this chart, when you first look at it, is entirely overwhelming. I put it here not to be explanatory. I put it here because I want you to see what we're about to tackle. We're about to go down a road and tackle a lot of different estates. There are a lot of different potential relationships that could be in play when you look at these different ownerships and rentals, right?
This would make sense in a little bit.
So when you look at this chart, I expect it to be overwhelming. What I don't expect it to be is overwhelming when we get to the end of today, because what we're going to do is work through all of these different interests, right? Now, Tasha, I don't even really understand your question, honestly. You said, how about if the owner did not have any restrictions and it's more than one person that could inherit the property? So who owns the, you're gonna have to help clarify. I want to try to answer.
I'm sorry. I kind of worded it wrong. What if the previous owner owned the property, that person dies, that owner has more than one child that could inherit the property, that didn't list which child they wanted to have the property?
You're talking about inheritance law now. We're going to get to that much later. The simple answer is this: either you die with a will, in which cases your wishes are followed, or if you die without a will, you're relying on the state of North Carolina to decide who gets your stuff, which is stupid. That's really stupid. Let me be clear, and I don't care whose toes I'm stepping on. If it's your mama and she's in the ground, God bless her soul, but she was stupid. If you die in this state without a will, you were dumb. The people who you love should go slap you right in your casket. That is really stupid. If you are sitting in this class right now and you don't have a will, go get one. They are not hard to do.
Yeah, my cats are getting everything when I go.
The only people who should not have a will are people who don't own anything. If you own anything, even a car, you need a will. Because otherwise you are, how many of you all trust the state of North Carolina to decide what to do with your stuff?
Heck no.
But that's what you're doing when you die without a will. You're saying to the state of North Carolina, oh, well, you figure out who gets my stuff.
Nope.
That's crazy. To me, that's crazy. Don't do that. Don't do that to yourself. Don't do that to the people you care about. Have a will.
Well, and that's the thing. Don't do it to the people that you care for, because they're the ones that have to clean up the mess when you're gone.
Yep. That's it. That's exactly right. So we're going to focus primarily on freehold. Now, remind me again what that word freehold means. What kind of
Ownership.
ownership? Good,
Ownership.
right? Good. Ownership. So there's lots of different types of ownership. Now, whenever we transfer ownership, remember, we're talking about two people involved. We talked about a grantor or a grantee. Who is transferring ownership? Remind me from Monday.
The grantor.
Grantor.
And so the grantee is the one receiving ownership. Now, why do we call them grantor, grantee instead of buyer and seller? Because the truth is not every transaction is a sale, right? So most of them are. And if we're talking about a sale transaction, who would the seller be? Would the seller be the grantor or the grantee?
Grantor.
And the buyer would be the grantee. But if somebody dies, that's not a sale. We still have a grantor and a grantee. If somebody dies, who's the grantor? The dead person or the living person that's getting the ownership?
Dead person.
The dead one.
The dead person. And the grantee is the living person who's taking over ownership. If we gift the property, who's the grantor? The one giving it away or the one getting it as a gift?
The one giving
Get away.
The one giving it away, right? So that's the reason we use the terminology grantor and grantee, because it covers every possible transfer of ownership, right? It deals with every possibility. The most common is obviously the sales transaction where the seller is the grantor and the buyer is the grantee. Look at this statement right here. This is a really important statement right here. The grantee gets whatever the grantor wants them to have.
I like that.
The grantee can only, listen, I want you to think of the grantor as your mama making dinner and you're the grantee. You don't get to walk in and say, I want filet mignon. You get whatever the hell she puts on the plate and you like it. Because it's the grantor's choice.
You don't have to like it. You just got to eat it.
That's it. You gotta eat it.
Especially from the South.
Your choices are eat or don't eat, and we don't care which you do. Now, so that being said, just like you as a child, most of us had a choice, either eat or don't eat. I mean, I know some of you were beaten into submission and you were made to eat, but most of us, mama put it on the plate, and if you didn't like it, well, then don't eat, fine. Right? You don't have to eat. You ain't gonna hurt my feelings. The grantee has that same choice, folks. We can't force a grantee to take ownership. But what we can do is say, as a grantor, this is the only type of ownership I'm willing to give you. What are the grantee's choices? Take it or what?
Leave it.
Leave it. That's it. Take it or leave it. This is why the grantor is such an important person when we transfer ownership, because ultimately the grantor is making the decision of, do I place limitations on this ownership? Do I limit the future use of this property? Do I limit the future ownership of this property? Or basically, do I just turn it over to this person and let them do whatever they want to do? That's the grantor's choice. So some of you all had moms that when you walked in the door, she said, what do you want for dinner? I'll make you whatever you want.
Not mine.
That's the kind of grantor we'd like to have in a transaction. One who's not willing, who doesn't want to place any restrictions on anything. Some of you had mom like mine that you walked in and the question was never even asked. It is what it is. Take it or leave it. We might get that grantor in a transaction too. Here's what I want you to understand though. The one choice the grantor cannot make. Look at what's down there in the green right there. Look at this statement right here. The grantor can never upgrade you. The grantor can, remember, this grantor has not owned this property since the beginning of time. Weren't they a grantee at some point? Weren't they the grantee at some point when they took ownership?
Yes, sir.
Right? When they took ownership, somebody had to decide whether or not to place restrictions on them. they cannot remove restrictions that were placed when they took ownership. Because those restrictions are, what's our favorite word? Give it to me, give it to me.
Pertinent.
They are a
forever.
They are attached to the property forever. So whatever restrictions were there when I took ownership of my property, at minimum, I have to pass those restrictions on to the next owner. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Now, do I have to pass exactly the same restrictions on? No, because I can add to those restrictions, but I cannot do what?
Take away.
I can't take away. Is that making sense for everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the grantor can add to the level of restrictions, but they cannot take away previous restrictions. So when we talk about that adding of restrictions, what are the things that a grantor can limit? What are the things that they can sort of say, you know what, you're not going to have full control here? There are two categories of things that a grantor can limit. They can limit time. They can say to the grantee, you are only going to own this property for a limited amount of time, and I'm not going to allow you to decide what happens past that point in time. I'm giving you ownership, but I'm putting a time limit on your ownership. And after that clock is expired, you no longer have ownership of the property. So you no longer have the rights to control what happens with the property. Somebody else is going to own the property after this period of time. Does that statement make sense for everybody? Now we're gonna talk more in detail about that, but I just want you to understand the basic concept that a grantor can choose to limit time. Do you all think that's very common, or is that something that sounds really weird, where a grantor goes, you are going to only own this property for a limited amount of time? What do y'all think? Is that common or uncommon?
I'd say it's
Uncommon, definitely.
Very
Very
uncommon.
uncommon.
Very uncommon for a grantor to limit time. Uncommon.
I have been doing real estate for over 10 years and I've never experienced that in my career.
Never had one transaction involving it, right?
Nope, very,
Yep.
very uncommon.
I've not encountered it more than twice in my entire career. And in both cases, it was a previous limitation of time. It wasn't the current owner who wanted to place a limitation of time. It was the current owner whose ownership was limited by time.
Right.
And of course, they were saying to me, well, I would like to sell this property. And I'm like, well, that's fine. Here's the problem. Nobody's going to buy it from you. I want y'all to think about that for a second. If Seth came to you and said, I want to sell you this house, you said, okay, well, how much you want for it? And Seth said $500,000. And you said, well, that's a good price. I'll pay you $500,000 for it. And he said, but here's the catch. I only own it for the next 3 years. So if I sold it to you at the end of 3 years, you wouldn't own it anymore either. Do you think you have very much luck finding a buyer like that?
No, heck no.
No, because remember, he can't take away the restrictions that were put there when he took over.
He can only transfer what he owns.
That's it.
That's it. He can't transfer more than what he owns. And he
Technically,
only
you could,
owns his
you could rent the
property.
property, right?
I'm sorry.
Technically, you could rent the property and that would be an appurtenance, right? Couldn't you do something insane and rent it for like 99 years, even if you had 3
Sure,
years?
you can rent it for a long time, but you could also transfer ownership for a period.
But if you only had it for 3 years, couldn't you do something insane? I know it's like rabbit hole, but couldn't you rent it for like 99 years, even if you still had a 3-year ownership left, so that the appurtenance stayed for 99 years of the rental?
You could not lease the property longer than you have the right to lease the property. So he could only lease.
And it'll make sense in a couple more slides. Like if I was transferring you ownership that I only had for 3 years, once that 3 years is up, you don't get to have the ownership anymore and it doesn't go back to me necessarily. So
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't try to intentionally overcome it, right?
Okay.
Now, Crystal said, not unless you're going to give me my money back after. Well, Crystal, I would say it would be your job to do the research and make sure you didn't get taken advantage of that way. And so that's another reason when we talk about these appurtenances, it's important to go find them because you're going to have to honor those things. Now, the much more common thing that a grantor could limit is use of the property. Ideally, though, I'm going to just throw this out there for you. I feel like you are the high performing group here. Ideally, what kind of grantor would we like? Would we like a grantor who limits time, or a grantor who limits use, or a grantor who doesn't place any limits at all? Which grantor would we prefer to have if we're transferring ownership of the property? Limits.
Unlimited.
Yeah, exactly. We would prefer that grantor who transfers with no limits. Now, one of the things I want to clarify before we go any further forward is it's really easy in your brain to think of the grantor. Doesn't work that way. There's no such thing as the grantor on a property. There's the current grantor. There's no such thing as the grantee on a property. There is the current grantee. And here's why, folks. Every time, how many times, if you look at a piece of land, how many times do you think that piece of land has been sold in the last 50 years for a piece of land on average? What do you think? 8 times?
20, 100 times.
How about the last 100 years? How about the last 200 years? How about the last 400 years? How many transfers of ownership have happened with a parcel of land over the last 300 to 400 years? A lot, right? And every single time ownership was transferred, guess what 2 people we have involved in that transfer?
A grantor and a grantee.
And a grantor.
A grantor and a grantee. Now, we talked about this on Monday a little bit. What is the document that a grantor is going to sign when they transfer ownership?
The deed.
A deed. So another thing that you will hear people say that is really a misnomer is, where's the deed? There is no such thing as the deed to a property. It's not a car. It doesn't have a title. Cars have a title. Cars have a piece of paper. But here's what I mean by that. A car has a title. No matter how many owners that car has, how many pieces of paper is it going to have called the title?
One.
Just
One. And you can look at the title and see everybody who's ever owned that car. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Yes.
Real estate does not work that way. A deed does not list everybody who's ever owned the property. A deed lists 2 people, the grantor
The grantee.
and the grantee. Here's why. Because every time that property has transferred, we are not recycling a previously used deed. We have a brand new what every time we're transferring ownership of that property.
Bundle of
The deed.
Brand
It's the
new
deed.
deed. We're not reusing the old deed. The old deed is useless.
I heard somebody say bundle.
Well, the deed is the document that transfers that bundle of rights. But as far as the actual piece of paper, there is no one deed. How many deeds are there to my house in Cary?
One.
Probably a lot.
Oh, a lot.
A lot of
Sorry.
them.
There's one current deed.
There's one current one, and that's the difference. There's one current one. So when people say go find the deed, immediately you should correct them and say, I'm not doing that. That's too damn much work. Because how many deeds would you be looking for, folks?
Hundreds.
Hundreds of them, right? Hundreds of them. What is much more simple and straightforward? Find what deed?
The current deed.
Current.
The most recent one, right? the most recent one. And I love the way that Justin, AKA Seth, had put that in the chat box. That a deed is like a bridge that connects between the two people who are changing ownership. The deed is the bridge between the buyer and the seller. The deed is the bridge between the grantor and the grantee. Every time we have a new transaction, we need a new bridge. We need a new connection. Because here's the thing, we're not connecting the same two people. Isn't the deed from before going to be different than the next deed? Because the deed from before connected an owner with a buyer. The new deed connects a different owner with a different buyer. Isn't every deed going to have a different set of people on it?
Yeah, it's like I transfer the ownership to you as one deed, and then the new ownership transfers the ownership from Travis to Leslie.
That's right. That's exactly right. Now, Elizabeth asks, is grant deed and deed the same thing? I'm not exactly sure the context of the question, but I'm going to say yes, Elizabeth, because what a deed does is grant ownership. The function of a deed is to grant ownership. That's what they do. That's what they do. You're talking, but you're muted, so I'm not sure if you're talking to yourself, talking to me, but let's see. Aloysia asked, if an appurtenance was put in place that states no one can stay on their property after the current grantee, would that legally make that property untouchable? So you are stating that the current grantee is the only one that can occupy the property. Here's the problem you're going to have with that. There's laws to make it illegal, in essence, for property to be abandoned. If you created a situation like that, sure, that would be the effect for a while. But once the property was deemed abandoned by the state, they're going to take over ownership of it. So essentially what you'd be doing is forfeiting it to the state by doing that. You can't essentially guarantee that a property is going to be abandoned at some point in the future and expect that to hold up. Okay. Now, I want to bring this back home, literally, to me, because I find that in some ways the best way to understand big concepts is to take it down to one thing, one, in this case, place. And if you look on your screen, what you see is a deed that is very near and dear to my own heart. Now, there's a lot of words on here, but the words you need to pay attention to, that one right there, it's a deed. So what two people are we looking for on a deed? What two groups of people are we looking for on any deed?
Grantor and
grantee.
Grantor and a grantee. What does a deed do? Before you even look at any more of a deed, what does a deed do? What is it accomplishing?
It grants ownership.
It grants ownership from what party?
Grantor.
Grantor to the
To the
grantee
grantee.
is ownership.
Let's look at the grantee. And by the way, this is the most recently recorded deed for a property located in Cary, North Carolina. The property that is known as 114 Heidinger Drive in Cary, North Carolina. This is the most recent deed on file. So we talk about recorded. Recorded simply means on file at the county courthouse. If you went down to the county courthouse and you researched 114 Heidinger Drive in Cary, the most recent deed you would find is a deed that was recorded. And if you look right here, it was recorded when? When does it say that deed was recorded?
2009.
Back in 2009, May of 2009. That is the most recent deed that is available for that property right now in Cary, North Carolina. So first of all, let me ask a question because I want you to make this connection. Is it reasonable to assume that if this is the most recent deed on file for 114 Heidinger Drive in Cary, North Carolina, that the people named as the grantees on this deed are still the current owners of 114 Heidinger Drive in Cary? Is that a reasonable assumption to make?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. And folks, it's the most important assumption in the world to make. Because
Yeah.
when somebody asks you, how do you prove ownership? You ready to have your world rocked right here? You can't prove ownership. It's impossible to prove ownership. This document right here does not prove ownership. What this document proved is that in May of 2009, somebody transferred ownership of this property. But here's what we know and what we're able to piece together.
Break through that mental block.
Has anybody else claimed to transfer ownership of this property since 2009? What do y'all think?
No.
No, because how would they make that
current deed?
How would they make that claim that they had transferred ownership? They would take what down to the county courthouse?
Yeah, take a deed.
A new deed. We do know. We do know. I saw the comment in the thing. We don't know. We do know because nobody else has been to the county courthouse and done what?
Made it public, recorded it.
Filed a new deed. Nobody else has walked into that county courthouse since 2009 and said, here's a new deed on 114 Heidinger Drive. So the very last people who walked into the Wake County Courthouse and said, I am the new owner of 114 Heidinger Drive. When did that happen, folks?
2009.
May of 2009. Here is the only assumption we can make. If the people on this deed as grantees were the last ones to walk into the Wake County Courthouse and claim they owned 114 Heidinger Drive in Cary, then guess who owns 114 Heidinger Drive in Cary?
Same people.
The grantee.
Those grantees. It literally is based on the honor system. How many of you feel like your world is rocked now that the only thing you got to do to own property in North Carolina is walk into a courthouse and say what?
Record this deed.
I own it. It's mine. Here's a deed that transfers ownership. It's the honor system. See, y'all want this to be written in stone. It's not. This document doesn't prove that I own my house today. It proves it proves one thing. I owned the house as of what day?
May 19th.
May 19th of 2009. And we have to draw the conclusion that if nobody else has showed up since May 19th of 2009 and claimed ownership, then who must still be the owner of the property?
You, the grantee.
The people that are highlighted right here. I don't know why the highlighter's not working. The people, because I put it on eraser, that's why. The people that are highlighted right there, they must still be the owners because nobody else has shown up and claimed ownership. Now, let me ask you a question. Who was claiming ownership before Andrew and Travis?
Shonda
Sandra and who?
Vincent.
Vincent. Sandra Mistison, who was formerly known as Sandra Bolden, and her husband, Vincent Mistison, were the ones who were claiming ownership before that. And they gave up their ownership when they signed this document.
Back in 2009.
Back in 2009. On May 13th, specifically of 2009, they gave up their ownership and gave it over to Travis and Andrew. Does everybody understand what you're looking at when you look at this document right here?
Yes, sir.
Now, here's the real question I have for you. How do we know that Sandra and Vincent were the owners of the property?
Because they signed it.
Well, that just says they said they were the owners.
They were the grantee.
Right, they were.
Grantor, excuse me.
They're the grantor on this deed, but what should they be on the previous deed? If we really want to know, and I want to know.
Grantee.
So what do we got to look at now?
The previous.
The last recorded
The
one.
one,
We got to look at the one recorded before what?
2000.
For
Before this one.
2009.
And lo and behold, look at
Or
what we have
2009.
here. Here is yet another deed.
Oh, and that's why it says.
And
formerly
this
known.
deed was recorded when?
2007.
2007.
2007. So this is the previous deed before. Now look at this deed. Who is the grantee here?
Miss Sandra Bolden.
Oh, Bolden.
Sandra Bolden. Let's talk about that for just a second. Let's talk about our girl here, Miss Sandra. Sandra Bolden took ownership of this property back in 2007. Does everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, see, you didn't know how nosy you were going to get to be when you got into real estate. Look who Sandra took ownership from.
Scott.
Looks like she got a divorce and remarried.
Bolden. What do y'all want to bet was happening here?
A
That's
divorce.
her.
Somebody done got divorced.
Oh.
Somebody got divorced, and Mr. Scott was giving up ownership of this property because his wife, who was soon to be his what? Ex-wife was getting ownership of the property. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
So previous to this, they owned the house together. Now she owns the house by her what?
So,
Herself.
By herself. But wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Go back and look at this deed from 2009. Look at right here who the grantor was. The grantor is not Sandra Bolden. Well, it's the same person because they made sure we know that because they said formerly known as Sandra Bolden.
Mhm.
But now what's her name?
Mr.
Sandra Mistison. Not only did she get divorced, folks, guess what she's done
got
already?
remarried.
Married.
She has
Peace,
done
Mr.
made the
Bolden.
She made the mistake again.
Stop it. Stop it. Don't say that.
She couldn't figure out the problem the first time, and she has repeated the mistake. She got divorced in 2007, and we don't know when
This
she got
happens.
remarried, but we know sometime between 2007 and 2009. Here's what's interesting, folks. Notice she's no longer a grantor by herself. Who's also a grantor on this deed?
her husband.
Her new husband, Vincent. Let me ask y'all a question. Do you think Vincent was entitled to some of the money from this house as a grantor on this deed?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, Sandra, you done messed up now. Huh?
Yep.
Real big.
You messed up.
That's a pretty big assumption, right? Anyway, because for all we know, it was a wedding present, and then she got given it, and they got married so that they could both sell the house and keep it together. We don't really know the relationship between them.
We don't. But reading the tea leaves, we know. Here's what we do know for sure: she was married to Scott in 2007, and they got divorced. And we're going to know that for sure when we back up one more deed. And we know for sure she married Vincent at some point during. Here's how we know for sure she was married to Scott. We don't know that for sure by looking at this deed, but if we look back, can we go back one further, folks?
Yeah,
Let's flip back in time one further.
get real nosy.
Let's get real nosy because this is what we have to do. Look at this deed. When was this deed recorded? On the same property, by the way. When was this deed recorded?
2004.
2004. And look at our grantees here.
Her and her husband.
Scott and Sandra, who were what?
Married.
Married.
Happily married.
Happily.
Happily married in 2004. And something changed between 2004 and 2007 when they became no longer happily married. But they were husband and wife when they bought the property back in 2004. So here's now what we've been able to piece together by looking at these documents in succession. If you go back to our deed, this is the current deed on the property, the most recent deed. We bought the property from a married couple. What we now know is that at one point she owned the house by herself before marrying Vincent. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And if we go even one more back, we know that she was married to the person Scott that she got ownership from previous to that. Is everybody with me on that? And that she and Scott actually bought the house together as a married couple. We know that just from looking at the deeds on this property. Isn't that pretty amazing?
Hey, Mr.
I
Travis.
love how the attorney on this one deed right here, his last name is Savage.
The attorney's deed is Savage. Yes.
Mr. Travis, I got a question. Why the deeds like named different, like warranty deed
We're
and
going to talk about that later, the different types of deeds and why you might choose. That's a great question, but we're going to hold it off for later. Different deeds are generally applied in different situations, but they all accomplish the same thing, which is transferring ownership.
They're just for different purposes and different circumstances. So that's more deep into the class, but it is, I love that it's a TD that you caught that, because the names do look different on the deeds, but ultimately what we're doing is transferring ownership.
Man, I love Russell's question right there. Look at Russell's question in the
He's
chat. I'm gonna read it out. Russell said, my current deed was signed on the 13th. And there it is right there. This deed made the 13th day of May 2009. But it wasn't recorded until May 19th, right? And here is what Russell's comment said. It said it was signed on the 13th, but presented in the courthouse on the 19th. So in those 6 days in between, I had ownership. Drew and I had ownership because ownership had been signed over to us. That's correct. But who is the public going to think own that property? If you had asked somebody at the courthouse on May 17th of 2009 who owned the property, what would their answer have been?
Sandra Vincent.
If you had called the police because Drew and I were moving into the house on May 17th, been like, I don't know who these two dudes are that are moving in, would the police have charged us with trespassing if they had shown up on May 17th?
Yes.
Yes, because as far as the law knows, the owners of this property were Sandra and Vincent until it was actually presented and filed at the county courthouse on May 19th. So does that present us with the idea that it's very important to get this deed recorded or filed as quickly as possible?
Yes.
Yes, very important concept that will come up a lot.
It will, absolutely. I love that question.
Travis, so it wasn't considered yours until it was until it's recorded, correct?
That's exactly right. So legally, it wasn't considered by the public, not considered ours until it's recorded. Now, from our perspective and from Sandra and Vincent's perspective, it was considered ours on the 13th. Because that's when we signed the document. If you had asked Sandra when she walked out of that closing, she would have said, I just sold my house, right? If you had asked us when we walked out of that closing, we would have just said, oh boy, we just bought a house. But for everybody else in the world, it's not final until it's what? Recorded. Until it's recorded.
Is it common to have that much of a gap in between that time?
It is not common. It's funny y'all bring that up. The closing attorney who did this is still a really good friend of mine. And I honestly give him shit about this all the time. I'm like, Rob, what were you doing for 6 days while you were not recording did you like go to Hawaii somewhere? What in the world was the whole closing for 6 days? And it's funny. I didn't realize there was much of a gap until I pulled my own deed long after the fact.
You just excited to move.
Travis, I have a question. Between those 6 days, technically Sandra could have sold the property to somebody else.
She could.
That's kind of fraud that was happening, right?
Right. She would have been committing fraud. She could not legally sell it to somebody else. But as far as the courthouse would know, they wouldn't realize that had happened. And that's the importance of getting that deed recorded very quickly.
And whose best interest?
In the grantee's best interest, for sure. It's the grantee's best interest to make sure that gets done more quickly. So we've gone back, but look at this. Folks, we've seen 3 deeds on the same property, and we've only gone back to what year?
2013.
2004. We're just back at 2004. And here's what I want you to understand. To establish a clean transfer of ownership, this is what we have to do. We have to keep going back further and further and further. If we went back even further, would we want to see Alan and Bonnie Sue be the grantees on the previous deed? Would that be ideally what we'd like to see?
Yes.
And if we do, thankfully, that's exactly what we see. If we go back and if you look at this deed takes us all the way back to 2000. This was recorded in March of 2000. I know that's small up there, the 9th of March in 2000. And if you notice that the grantees on this deed are Alan and Bonnie Sue Bruner, who were the grantors on the next one. And they bought the house from a guy named Roland C. Booma, and he's looking for—
Their attorney did great at
Right.
specifying that. He was unmarried.
He was looking for a spouse back in 2000. We don't know if he's still looking or not, but back in 2000, he was looking for one. That's free advertisement right there that they give you, just letting everybody know you were on. No, it's actually very important, because if he was married, would his spouse also need to be signing this deed?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And so that's why it's really important to identify that he was an unmarried person.
So Rachel does have a good question. She said, so if something would have happened to the home in the between time from when yours was signed to when it was recorded, would it have been Sandra's responsibility?
It would have been a legal mess.
Right.
Because Sandra would have said, it's not my responsibility. I signed over ownership.
On the 13th.
And I would have said, well, that's fine. I've got insurance. But what do you think my insurance company would have said?
You didn't own the property.
I don't own the property yet. It would have been a problem. And that's why there's a danger zone between that signing of the documents and the recording of the documents. There's always going to be.
But we have, and I might be getting a little too far ahead, but we have a document that binds Travis and Sandra and Drew and Sandra and Vincent, but nobody else knows about that document.
That's it. That's it. We've got that deed, which has been signed, but it hasn't been recorded, so the public doesn't recognize it. That's exactly right. So we can take this back.
The legal mess.
A legal mess potentially there. We could take this back even a step further. Now, remember, we're still looking at the same property. How many deeds have we now seen? This is like 5, right? 5 deeds, same property. This one, as you can tell by the quality of the scan, goes back quite a bit further. This one actually goes back to 1989. If you look right there, this one takes us back to 1989. And this one shows Mr. Booma, who was also unmarried in 1989. So a long-time bachelor. He was unmarried in 89, bought the property.
He probably living it up.
He was unmarried in 2000 when he sold the property, and he bought the property from an Eric and Susan Wiedenman back in 1989. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Somebody asked the question. It's a great question. Grant asked, is there a certain number of years or transfers that we need to research? The answer to your question, Grant, is a really good answer. Thankfully, in the state of North Carolina, we're going to talk about the specific law later, so you don't need to write it down right now. We have a law that basically says 30 years is far enough. If you go back in time 30 years and you can establish a clear transfer of ownership for at least 30 years, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. So this would, on this particular deed, on this particular property, this would be as far back as you would go, because you would be more than 30 years into the past. Taj, you had a question? You still, there we go.
Yes, sorry. Okay, so I might be complicating this in my mind. So for the grantee and the grantor, when they say wife or unmarried, do they put that for the type of interest someone has in a home? So if they're married, they generally get 50 interest or something like that. But if it's like a friend and another friend who is owning this property, they may not have the same percentage of interest. So do they put that in there for?
We're actually going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the different types of shared ownership. It's called concurrent ownership. And you're exactly right. When it's a husband and wife, we don't bother to say who owns what share, because the only way a husband and wife can own property together is to own it equally together. But when it's people other than husband and wife, we might want to specify, and we would right there on the deed. So as an example, on our deed, if you go back and look at ours, it doesn't specify. And so the assumption there legally is that they're equal co-owners, right? That they concurrently own it in an equal 50-50 share. But we could have, for example, put that Andrew owned 20% of the property and Travis owned 80% of the property. And that would need to be specified on the deed if you were going to have an unequal ownership share. But the law assumes if you don't bother to specify percentages, you mean for them to be equal. So that's,
and I know there's probably a lot of thoughts that are going in with that, like the 80-20%, and we'll get a little more in depth shortly about what that means.
We will. How many of you feel like you've gotten a little bit of perspective here about what a deed is and what purpose it serves when we get ready to transfer ownership and going back and researching? Because this is the only way to really establish whether or not the people who are currently trying to sell the property actually have the right to sell the property, actually are, as far as we can tell, the owners of the property. That's called a title search, and it's called an opinion of title, or we want to give an opinion that these people have a good title. Zoe asked a great question. Zoe asked, is it our responsibility as real estate brokers to pull these deeds from the courthouse, or is it the responsibility of the current seller to make sure the new buyer gets everything transferred? So here's the thing, and this is what you need to understand, Zoe, because Zoe asked a great question. The seller doesn't owe the buyer anything. The seller is completely not responsible for anything relating to the buyer. It's clearly in the buyer's best interest to do all this research. Why do you think they hired a professional to look out for their best interest? We are that what?
Professional.
That professional. So is it our responsibility? Absolutely, it's our responsibility. Now, here's where you need to tune me in and listen real good on this though. Just because something is my responsibility does not mean I am going to be the person who does it.
Or whose best interest it's in, really.
That's it. My responsibility means I'm going to make sure it gets done correctly. That means either I do it myself, which I could, or I recommend to my client, the buyer, that they hire somebody who's even a higher level expert than me at pulling these documents and doing this research. How many of you all think it might be a good juncture right here to say to a buyer, you need a closing attorney. You need an attorney to research these documents. Would that fulfill my responsibility by recommending to them that they engage the services of an attorney to get this accomplished in the transaction? What do y'all think?
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
See, that's going to come up so often in this class. People say, well, is it my responsibility to make sure the house gets inspected for my buyer? Yes. Does that mean you got to go in the crawl space with your coveralls on? No. It means you've got.
We're the facilitator.
That's exactly right. It means you've got to stress to the buyer the importance of that process and recommend them to a professional who can give them that information. But we are absolutely responsible for making sure these things get done. That's why we are the experts. That's why we're the professionals.
At the heart of it, it's really the buyer's responsibility to get that stuff done. That's why they hire us. And then we do become responsible for it, but it's really in their best interest.
Well, that's why they got the professional guidance in the first place. If the buyers could do it on their own, they wouldn't have hired us. They wouldn't have brought us into the picture. We're not there just to open the door. We're there to protect their best interest. Now, I do want to point out one thing. I know y'all are sick of looking at my property. But I want to point out one thing to you because it's going to tie back to an idea and it might be a little bit mind-blowing for all of you. Now, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back all the way to my deed. Do you see anything at all on my deed right there about restrictions or covenants on the property? Just a quick glance. What do y'all see anything about restrictions or covenants?
No.
No. If you go back to the deed before that, do you see anything at all about restrictions or covenants?
No.
No.
No. So here's what I'm pointing out to you. If you just go look at one deed, would it be easy to assume that this property has no covenants on it? Because you don't see anything at all on a deed about covenants, right?
Right.
Even if you go back to the deed before that, do you see anything at all about restrictions or covenants?
No.
No.
No. Even if you go back to the one before that, you don't see anything about restrictions or covenants. But if you look real closely at that deed from 1989, look at the statement that shows up on that deed from 1989 on this property. It says restrictive covenants recorded in book 2544, page 289 of the Wake County Registry. Let me ask y'all a question, folks. If there were covenants attached to this property in 1989, are they still attached today, even though none of the most recent deeds make reference to them?
Yes.
You better believe they are. And that's why this research has to be done, because we can't establish whether or not there are actually these restrictions attached to the property by just looking at the current deed. We've got to go back deed by deed by deed and see if there's ever any mention of these covenants. Because once they're there for how long?
Forever. What if the book was destroyed?
Well, the books, thankfully, should not be destroyed because they're all digitized at this point in time. So you can literally right now go to the Wake County Register of Deeds website, and you can type in book number 2544, page 289, and you will get a copy of the covenants that still exist on this property today.
There should be multiple copies. The real estate agents who did it should have them in their files, etc.
But you've got the main digitized copies, which are hosted in like 56 different clouds, and they're pretty secure at the courthouse. Elizabeth, you had a question?
Yeah, so I rely on the attorney to go through this and find these things and figure out what is on book 2865, page whatever. I rely on the attorney for that, or do I then have a meeting with him and ask him what came up, or will he call me and tell me what came up, or how do I not miss something?
Well, that's for you to figure out as the professional. You know, like what I would recommend is exactly some of the things you mentioned, which is follow up with the attorney a couple of weeks after you've sent them the file and say, did you find anything? Have you done the title search? Is there anything that popped up? Is there anything I need to make them aware of that I was not aware of? And the attorney by this point should have gotten back to this point and say, well, I did find some covenants back that were recorded back in the 70s on the property. Have you given them a copy of those covenants? No. Well, let's get a copy of them, because we can go to the Wake County Register of Deeds website and we can pull those covenants. When you pull that book and that page, you're going to get the original covenants as they were recorded whenever they were first recorded, and you hand them to the buyer and you say, these were placed on the property 30, 40, 50 years ago, and they still are in effect today.
Okay, gotcha.
Good.
Thank you.
So Jennifer asked if covenants and appurtenant the same thing. Yes and no, Jennifer. Appurtenances are the big, broad category of any permanent attachment to the land. Covenants are a type of appurtenance. So if you want to take it away from, to use an analogy, the question you just asked me is, are stilettos and shoes the same thing? Well, yes and no. All stilettos are shoes, but not all shoes are stilettos, right? So not all covenants are appurtenances, but not all appurtenances are covenants. Covenants are just a type of, they're a subset of appurtenances.
Pertinent is any physical structure, legal idea, concept that attaches to real property. Covenants branch under the appurtenance, and it's any idea or concept.
Yep. How do we all feel so far about this idea of researching a deed and going back in time and seeing how the transfers happen to make sure that we have the clear owners of the property, and seeing how these restrictions were attached years and years before? Everybody okay with that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hey, Travis, can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Howard, all right. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I want to ask a question.
Sure.
Based on what you were talking about at the beginning of this discussion. I have one of my deeds here for one of the properties that I have, and my question is going to be on, I'm looking at your other chart. fee simple, absolute, or fee simple, defeasible.
Yep.
Let me read on this deed. Okay, to have and to hold said tract or partial of land with all of the privileges and appurtenances thereunto belonging until the said grantee, which is myself, in fee simple.
Yeah.
So how do I know? Okay, it says in fee simple, but how do I know if I have fee simple absolute or fee simple?
Fee simple absolute, fee simple and fee simple absolute mean the same thing, and that's going to be our discussion when we come back from a break. That's about what we're about to dive into. But fee simple and fee simple absolute mean exactly the same thing. If it was defeasible, the word defeasible would be there.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So on that note, it's a good time for us to take a break, because when we come back, we're going to start to talk about the ways. If you notice, none of these grantors in all those deeds placed any restrictions. All of these deeds were grantors that we like, no restrictions. In other words, the grantee takes on no additional restrictions. That does not mean that there are no restrictions. Are there restrictions against this property? Did we see that there are some covenants that are restricting the use of this property? Did we see that when we went far enough back, right? It just means that the new grantor on each one of these deeds did not add any additional restrictions. Covenants are restrictions, they're rules. Don't make this harder than it is. If your mama tells you to be home at 10 o'clock, that's a covenant. If your property has a rule attached to it that says you can't have your trash can in front of the house, that's a covenant. If your property has a rule that says the houses that are built there have to be 3,000 square feet or bigger, that's a covenant. And once those rules are attached to the property, they are attached forever. And every subsequent owner has to follow those rules from now until the end of time. Okay, so let's take a break right there. I'm gonna pause the recording. Resuming here on slide 69. So before the break, we talked about transferring ownership. And if you think of like ownership, it's almost like a relay race. You know, the Olympics just ended, so you know, maybe you watch some of the relay races. If you think of the relay race, like think of ownership of the property as sort of like the baton in a relay race. Every time you have one of those handoffs, you have a grantor and you have a grantee, and they're transferring ownership of the property. And then the next transfer, you have another transfer from a different grantor to a different grantee. Well, when we do those transfers of ownership, we mentioned that the grantor has a choice to make. The choice the grantor has to make is, am I going to limit what this grantee can do with the property, or am I going to limit how long this grantee is going to own the property, or am I going to not limit what this grantee does at all? And what kind of grantor did we say we preferred to have in a transfer? The grantor who was limiting time, the grantor who's limiting use, or the grantor who's not placing any limitations at all?
No, who's not placing
limitations at all.
The grantor is not placing limitations. That grantor is called a fee simple absolute grantor. Or as we talked about earlier, the question came up, Howard asked, it could also just be called a fee simple. You don't have to necessarily, this word right here, absolute, is sort of optional. You can just say fee simple or fee simple absolute. They mean exactly the same thing. So you might want to make a note for yourself in your notes of that fee simple and fee simple absolute mean exactly the same thing. But the key word here is actually this word. It is the most simple and straightforward of all ownership transfers. And it is simple and straightforward because the grantor is simply saying, I'm done. I'm out of the picture. I don't care what you use the property for. I don't care how long you own the property. It's not mine anymore. I'm transferring it to you. You do with it whatever you want. But now, here's where you got to tune me in. You got to pay attention here, folks. You got to listen to this because you're going to miss this on the test if you're not zeroed in right here. Fee simple absolute does not mean that there are no restrictions attached to the property. It means that the grantor right now is not attaching any new restrictions to the property. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
The grantor is basically saying, listen, you're going to have to follow the same rules I had to follow. These were the rules that were in place when I took the property over, and you got to follow those same rules, but I'm going to do you a solid. I'm not going to put any additional restrictions on here. That is a fee simple absolute transfer of ownership. So here's how you apply that to a test question. Can a property that is transferred fee simple absolute have restrictive covenants on it? What's your answer to that question? Can a property that's transferred fee simple absolute have restrictive covenants?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes. As long as the covenants are old and were placed there by a previous grantor, and the current grantor is not adding any new restrictions, that is a fee simple transfer. Is everybody okay with that statement?
Yes.
Fee simple has to do with right now. Is the current grantor on this deed adding any restrictions or not? And so when we have a fee simple transfer, they're not adding anything. It's simple. It's straightforward. There's nothing to confuse you. And that's why this is the most common type of ownership. You'll be in this business a long time, hopefully.
Great.
The vast majority of transactions that you ever deal with will be fee simple. That very rarely will the grantor place additional restrictions. Let's see if you're really paying attention. See if you're really thinking about this. Now,
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go for it.
Where does this fall under fee versus non-fee?
So it's got the word fee in it, which means these are inheritable forms of ownership transfer. So that word fee just means inheritable. So what that means is this is an inheritable type of an ownership transfer.
So you'll let us know when it's non-inheritable.
Okay. When we get to one that's not inheritable, that's non-fee, I'll make sure to point it out. Yep.
Thank you.
So here's what I want to point out to you about fee simple transfers, and then see if you've made a connection here. If Leslie sells her house, is she very likely to want to place restrictions on the future use or future ownership, or is she pretty much not going to care as long as they pay her?
Not going to care.
She's not going to care. So is she probably going to do fee simple, or is she going to do something more complex?
Fee simple.
Be simple.
Fee simple, yeah. What sellers can you think of as a group are the most likely, if you were selling a house right now, to give something less than fee simple, which simply means what sellers are likely to be placing restrictions on the property as they are selling it to a homeowner? We're going to use homes for right now, but what sellers are most likely, see how much you're thinking right here, to be placing these restrictions right now as they sell these properties?
New developments.
Developments, builders. That's exactly right. When do you think the builders are placing all these covenants and restrictions on the property? When they sell it for the first time to that new homeowner. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
So most of the time, because here's the thing, the builder doesn't want to put the restrictions on the property before they sell it, because then who would have to follow the restrictions? Think about it.
They would.
They would. They don't want to follow their own rules. They don't want to follow a rule that they can't put a stack of pallets on a lot, because they might want to put a stack of pallets on a lot, but they want to make sure the future owners can't put a stack of pallets on a lot. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
So they're probably not going to put those restrictions on the property while they still own it. they're going to take the advantage of that deed when they transfer ownership to the first buyer who buys that house from them, and whammo, they're going to hit it with 72 pages worth of covenants and restrictions. And those 72 pages of covenants and restrictions become, what's our favorite A word?
Pertinent.
Pertinent to that property for how long?
Forever.
Forever.
I
And
have another favorite A word for you, but we're not going to use that.
well,
anymore.
that, yeah, I have, there are A words that I go by from time to time too. Yes, that's for sure. That's
Travis, is that progression that I sent you correct?
let's
share it.
let's see, let me take a look here. Fee means inheritable, fee simple, means no new restrictions added at the time of transfer. Yes, that is correct. That is,
Okay, thank you.
yes, you're welcome. So Taj, you've gone too far, and it's okay. I'm not picking on you, because that's what you see in the real world. In the real world, you see an HOA. That's all you see is the HOA. Here's what I want you to understand. Pretend HOAs don't exist. Who would enforce the covenants if the HOA never existed? If the HOA wasn't a thing, who do you think would manage or enforce the covenants?
It should be the homeowner.
That's right. But except the homeowner doesn't want to enforce the covenants on themselves. Who do they want to enforce the covenants on?
Their neighbors.
Everyone else.
Their neighbors. And folks, that's the answer we're always going to be looking for in this class. Whose job does it ultimately become to enforce these covenants? It's the job of all of those neighbors that are subject to the same restrictions to hold each other accountable. Does that make sense for everybody now?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It falls to themselves to enforce the rules on themselves. And ultimately, that's what happens. Now, that's when restrictions are being applied by the grantor. In fee simple absolute, though, no restrictions are being applied. There might be some old ones, but the current grantor is not applying any new restrictions on either use of the property or the timing of how long we're going to own the property. As just a reminder here, you can't strip away restrictions or covenants, appurtenances, when you transfer ownership. The fleas come with the dog. Whatever restrictions were in place when the current grantor took over ownership, they're going to stay in place for the next owner. We're just not adding to that list. I really can't reiterate that enough, that fee simple does not mean there are no restrictions. It means there are no new restrictions. Does everybody see the difference between those two statements?
Yes.
Okay. That's a really important distinction for you to get in your brain. Okay. So here's an example of fee simple absolute they may give you on the test that would throw people off. It says Alicia owns a farm in Albemarle, North Carolina, which she received from her deceased uncle almost 20 years ago. When her uncle transferred the property to Alicia, he placed a restriction on the property stating that it could not be subdivided. So are we clear that the uncle's transfer is not fee simple? Is everybody clear that the uncle's transfer is not fee simple? Are we good with that?
Yes.
Because the uncle placed a restriction. So this one, we don't know what it is yet, but we're just going to put not fee simple for this one, because that they placed a restriction. But then look at the next bullet point. It says Alicia sells the farm to Val, and Val must abide by the restrictions placed 20 years before, but Alicia adds no new restrictions. So what kind of transfer is Alicia's transfer?
Fee simple.
Simple absolute.
This one is fee simple or fee simple absolute. They mean the same thing, because Alicia is just saying, listen, my uncle, the asshole, put this restriction on the property, but I'm not adding to those restrictions. I'm just transferring it to you with the restrictions that were already in place. Does everybody see how that might trip you up on a test if you're not careful, right?
Yes.
You got to pay attention to the fact that no new restrictions are being applied to the property, because even though there are old ones, Alicia's transfer is fee simple absolute because of the no new ones. How we all feel there? Pretty good?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. All right.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry, Travis. You mind going back real quick? There we go. All good.
okay. So now let's talk about, again, we're going to start to introduce, because fee simple really doesn't take long to really talk about because it is the most simple of the transfers. The other ones are more complex because the other ones involve a grantor who does want to limit things, a grantor who does want to place limitations, new limitations on the ownership of the property. And remember, we said that the grantor can limit one of two things, either time or use. The grantor can choose to limit time. Now, let me just go ahead and get one of those Alice in Wonderland going down through the looking glass questions out of the way. Is it possible for a grantor to restrict time and use? Yes. Are you going to be asked about it on a license exam? No. Are we going to talk about it in here? No, because we're here to pass a license exam. Anything is technically possible, but there's no need for us to overly complicate this. Okay, fair enough. All right. So from our perspective in the class, we're going to talk about grantors who either limit time. And when we talk about time, what we're talking about is limiting how long the grantee is going to own the property, literally putting a clock, like running a stopwatch and saying, you own the clock, you own the property until the clock counts down to 0. And that's it. Then you don't own it anymore. That's a big restriction. Or limiting the future use. You can own it for as long as you want to. I don't care about how long you own it. You can sell it, do whatever you want to with it. But everybody from you forward has to limit this use. And so those are the ones that we're about to go into. Now, there's still freehold. What does that mean? What does that word mean from earlier? You got to keep using those vocabulary words.
Freehold.
Ownership.
Ownership. They're owned.
Ownership, right? They still own these properties. These are still examples of ownership. And most of these are going to be fee types of ownership. What does that word fee mean?
They have restrictions.
What is the word?
Permanent.
No limitations.
No, that's fee simple.
Inheritable. Inheritable.
That's why you got to do vocabulary words, folks. Those vocabulary words are already jumping up and biting you like bullets in your butt when you're running away. You gotta nail that vocabulary. You gotta know when you see the word freehold, that means ownership. You gotta know when you see the word fee, that means what?
Inheritable.
Inheritable. The vocabulary is so important to make sure you make notes for yourself on that, because it's not that in the real world you're going to walk around talking about words like freehold or fee. You're not. But on the test, they're simply going to identify something as being fee, and you're going to have to make the connection. Oh, they mean inheritable. And so if you don't know that vocabulary word, you'll miss the test question because of it. Okay. So are we limiting time or are we limiting use? We're going to start with the limitations of time. So just I want everybody to take a minute. I want you to center yourself. And I want you to take a deep breath. And I want you to get your mind in the right place. We're transferring ownership. Who are the two parties when we're transferring ownership? In every transfer of ownership, who are the two parties?
Grantor and grantee.
Who is in control of this transfer? Who's driving the bus?
Grantor.
Grantor is. Okay. The grantee has to accept whatever the grantor is transferring to them. Is everybody with me on that so far?
Yes.
Now, what I'm telling you is we have a grantor who, for whatever reason, and we'll try to talk about some reasons to try to give you something to anchor it to, but for whatever reason, the grantor has decided that they do not want to transfer unlimited time of ownership to the new owner. They want to transfer ownership. It's not a lease. They are transferring ownership. Let's get that in your head. Are we transferring ownership? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. I'm going to say it one more time. Are we transferring ownership? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So generally speaking, if we're transferring ownership, is the grantee going to be able to sell this thing? Can you sell things that you own?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Is the
Yes.
grantee going to be able to rent out this property? Can you rent out things that you own?
Yes.
Yes.
Is the grantee going to be able to leave this property as an inheritance, generally speaking? Can you leave things that you
No.
own as an inheritance?
No.
No.
Generally speaking, I'm not
Yes.
asking you.
Yes.
Yes.
You're trying to outpace me. That's why you F this stuff up. Stay with me. Generally speaking, can you leave things that you own as an inheritance?
Yes.
Yes.
Don't make it harder than it is. It's ownership. When you start trying to differentiate this in your brain is when you go way off the reservation. The grantee is going to be the what of this property once
Owner.
this is signed?
Owner.
The owner. So they're an owner. Do they have to maintain the property?
Yes.
Yes.
Do they have to pay taxes on the property?
Yes.
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 Do they get to use the property?
Yes.
Do
Yes.
they get to make money off the property?
Yes.
Yes.
Can they sell the property?
Yes.
Yes.
Can they leave it to their heirs in their will when they die?
Yes.
Yes. So don't overly complicate this thing. Here's the one wrinkle we're going to put in this. Now, this is the wrinkle, but don't make the rest of them the wrinkle because the rest of them are exactly the same as fee simple. Okay. Let's talk about one of you all for a second. We'll take Patty. Let's take Patty as an example. Normally, if Patty is the grantee on a deed, and that's a fee simple deed, how long is Patty going to own that property?
However long she wants to.
As long as she wants to, right? Forever if she wants to. Forever. As long as she wants to. Can she decide to sell it? Sure. Can she decide to keep it? Sure.
Yes.
Can she die and decide who it goes to after she dies?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure. And nobody's going to make that decision for her, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
If Patty has the grantor who wants to limit time, though, if Patty has a grantor who wants to give her a life estate, it's not going to be up to Patty how long she owns this property. Who is dictating in advance the maximum amount of time that Patty is allowed to own this property?
The grantor.
The grantor who transferred ownership to her on her deed. The person who signed ownership over to her is dictating right there on her deed, Patty, you are the grantee, but you own this property until, and the grantor gets to decide when that is. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Yes. That is called a life estate. The grantee is going to own the property for a limited amount of time. So here's the question then. Is the grantee limited in any other way? What's your answer?
No.
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 Can Patty sell this farm that she just got from her great uncle as a life estate? Can she sell it to somebody else?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. With limited time.
It's hers. Stop, don't worry about adding wrinkles to it. Can she sell it? What's the answer?
Yes.
Yes.
She owns it, so she can sell it. Can she farm the farm if she wants to and make money off of it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can she decide?
She's an owner.
Can she decide to do nothing with the farm if that's what she wants to?
Yes.
Yes.
Can she rent it out to somebody else to farm it and just make the money off of it?
Yes.
Yes.
She can do anything she wants with it because she is the owner. It is hers. Are we all clear on that so far?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes.
The only wrinkle, the only one, is that Patty doesn't get to decide for how long she does those things. Patty has been limited by her grantor. Her uncle that transferred this farm over to her put a limitation of time on this thing. Is everybody with me on that?
Mhm.
Yes.
Now, what's really interesting in our world here is that the limitation of time is not going to be a number of months or weeks or years. Okay. Colin asked, does she become an owner or the owner? She's the owner. She's the only one. She was granted ownership of the property. Okay. So in our case, this time limitation is not going to be in weeks or days or years. My opinion has always been we should call these things another thing. They probably shouldn't be called life estates. What they really should be called is death estates.
Dun, dun, dun.
Because the time limitation that the grantor has put on Patty is going to be based on somebody dying, not necessarily Patty, but somebody. The grantor has given Patty ownership until somebody that the grantor chooses. Could the grantor choose anybody?
Yes.
I mean, could the grantor say that Patty owns the property until Betty White dies?
Yes.
Right, which would be awesome because Betty White's going to live forever, right? We know that. She's already 174. She's not dying anytime soon, right?
That's true.
But could the grantor say that Patty owns the property till Britney Spears dies?
Yeah.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I think that might happen before Betty White dies. I think
No.
all parties concerned, that might be the case. Who knows? But considering the levels of interesting that go on there. But here's the thing, it's up to the grantor. Could the grantor tie it to Patty's own lifetime? Could the grantor say Patty owns the problem until Patty dies?
Yes.
Owns the property until Patty dies. Could we do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's up to the grantor, but it's always going to be based on some stated person's death. Is everybody with me so far on that?
Right.
Okay.
Can I try an example of this?
Sure.
Would it be like if I was granted a life estate and then after I died, it would go to the University of North Carolina?
Sure. Absolutely. And so the question, people often ask the question, well, why would the grantor want to do that? Well, in my opinion, here's what the grantor is trying to control. They want to benefit Patty for some period of time, but ultimately they don't trust what Patty would do with the property long-term. Isn't that really what we're saying here?
Yes.
The grantor is really saying, I don't trust you, Patty. I like you, so I'm going to transfer ownership to you, but I don't trust you. You might give it to, NC State, which would hurt my soul. So that's not going to happen. So I'm going to dictate what's going to happen with this property when you no longer own it anymore. And so these are very controlling people, these grantors that do this. It's a control thing. Now,
Okay, I have a question.
Mr. Travis?
Go ahead, Eliza.
So you said that they are able to sell it once they are the owners. How does that play if they were trying? I guess I'm getting stuck with how can you sell something that is not going to continue to be yours? Like, how can you make that decision?
So Aloysia has asked a wonderful question. How can you sell something that's not going to continue to be yours? Aloysia, we go back to exactly what we've talked about previously. Whenever I buy a property, don't I have to be really aware of any restrictions that are attached to that property because I'm going to have to abide by those restrictions? Isn't that true? So, play that forward. The person who is purchasing the property from Patty better be aware that their ownership is going to also be. Because yours is, I don't know why you got that reverb. I don't know if you got two machines on or something. I'm not sure why that reverb keeps coming in.
I think it goes back to Travis thinking you can only sell what you own.
Yeah.
Right.
That's it.
That's it. So if somebody were, so don't overcomplicate this. If somebody were to buy the property from Patty, let's say Patty had been given ownership until Patty dies. Is everybody with me on that? Patty owns the property until Patty dies. If she tried to sell the property to Summer, would Summer need to be very careful in her research and make sure she understood that the person she's purchasing from only owns this property for a limited amount of time. What do y'all think?
Yep.
Yes.
Absolutely. And something that helps me reframe this in my mind is that I have to remember this is a restriction that we're placing on the property again, okay?
And
it's
the
a pertinent.
And the restriction and the person are not the same thing. What's the restriction? Patty's ownership ends when what happens?
Betty White dies.
When Betty White dies.
Somebody dies. Betty White.
Dies. We'll stick with that one. Patty's ownership ends when Betty White dies. When Summer buys the property, when is Summer's ownership going to end if the restriction stays exactly the same?
When Betty
White dies. And if Summer sold the property to Hilda, when would Hilda's ownership end?
Whenever
When Betty White dies. Does that help, Aloysia? Does that help me? Because the restriction stays with the property. So from a practical standpoint, would it probably be very hard to sell a property? If Patty was walking around trying to sell this farm to somebody and say, look, I own this beautiful farm out here in Duplin County until Betty White dies. Somebody would look at her and be like, Betty White's 194 years old. I'm not buying that from you because she's going to be dead next week. Like that would literally not, it would not work, right? Just because it's possible doesn't mean it's practical, right?
Mr. Travis, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Hey, just one step back. So you were saying that limited time is based on anybody's death? If I heard you correct?
Correct.
Anybody.
Anybody.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody. So Russell, to your question, everything is possible under the law, but for our purposes in the class, we only talk about it from the standpoint of human people that are named by the grantor. Yeah. Okay. So let's start to define the cast of characters that we have in this thing. We know we have the grantor who creates this whole situation. They are the ones who are creating these restrictions. Is everybody clear on that? We good with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The grantee is also known as the life tenant. So in our case, Patty owns the property until Betty White dies. Patty would be our what?
Life tenant.
She is our life tenant. The life tenant is the person who has limited time ownership. They are the ones who the grantor said, you can own it until this person dies. That's the life tenant. Everybody good with that?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So the life tenant, they are the owner of the property. I know that word tenant can be confusing there, but the life tenant is the owner of the property. They can use it, they can rent it, they can make money off of it, they can sell it as long as they make the restriction known and clear. Do you think these restrictions, by the way, are going to be publicly available?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Here's how you know it's going to
yes.
be publicly available. Where is the grantor going to put this restriction?
They're going to record it.
On the deed.
On the deed.
On Patty's deed. And what is Patty going to have to do with that deed if she wants to be recognized as the owner at all?
Record it.
She would have to take it and file it or record it at the county courthouse, and then who can see it once it's recorded at the county courthouse?
Anybody who searches.
Anybody. So if Summer is, sorry, Summer, dumb enough to buy this thing with this life estate on it, it ain't nobody's fault but whose?
Summer's.
Her own.
Because all she had to do was go to the courthouse and look at Patty's deed, and she'd be like, whoa, heck, no way. She only owns this thing till Betty White dies? Like the Golden Girls went off 70 years ago. Yeah, like she got to be dead by now, right? Is that starting to click with everybody? Right?
Yep.
So it's going to be very obvious if this sort of a restriction has been put in place because it's literally on Patty's deed and it's going to be recorded. Okay. Now let's talk about the other person that's important here. The measuring life. Yes. So Kayla asked, you only have a life tenant when there's a life estate. That is correct. Life tenant is a very specific terminology for life estates. Let's talk about the other important person, cast of characters here, the measuring life. The measuring life should always be Flavor Flav, but it will not always be Flavor. Not every grantor has a sense of humor. I mean, I cannot imagine anybody better to be the measuring life than the man wearing a clock around his neck 24 hours a day. But not all grantors have my sense of humor. So not every grantor will name Flava Flav as the measuring life, though they should. In our case, when we said that Patty owns the property until Betty White dies, who is our measuring life?
Betty White.
Betty White.
Betty White. Betty White's our measuring life. She is the person that the grantor named and said until they die, right? She is the so who is Betty White's biggest fan now after this thing has been created?
Patty.
Patty is. If she hears that Betty White's in the hospital, she is rushing over there to make sure no plugs are pulled, no switches are turned off. She's taking chicken soup. She's trying to do everything she can, because Patty is only going to own the property as long as that measuring life is still alive. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes. Yes.
Now, and I think this next statement I'm going to make is where people sometimes get confused. It's actually most common that the life tenant and the measuring life are very closely connected to each other. What do you think is going to be the most common setup here? Do you think it's going to be most common that the life tenant and the measuring life are two different people, or more common that the life tenant and the measuring life are actually the same person? What do y'all think?
Same person.
Same person.
Same person. That's going to be much more common. It's going to be much more common to say, we're giving the property, we're transferring the property to Amy until Amy dies. We're transferring it to Amy for Amy's lifetime is the more common one, but it can be either way. Russell asked, once Betty dies, is it an immediate transfer, or is there like a grace period? It's immediate. It's instant. Transfer of ownership is instant. So I'll give you an example, a real life example of this. My grandfather had a life estate in a farm in Edgecombe County. Now we have a family farm that's our farm, but my grandfather had a second farm that he had a life estate in. He was left a life estate by a couple that died in the 40s. They didn't have any children. He took care of them. He was a young man. He kind of helped out and did a lot of things around the house for them and took care of them until their 80s. When the wife died, husband died first, wife died second. When she died second, they did not have any children. They really didn't have any natural heirs. She wanted to leave her entire estate to the Children's Home of North Carolina as a donation to the Children's Home of North Carolina back in the 40s.
Oh, wow.
But she wanted to, in essence, reward / thank my grandfather for 20 years of essentially looking out for them when he wasn't related to them. He didn't have any, he just knew them and he took care of them because they didn't have anybody else to take care of them. And so she left my grandfather their farm, their house, for the duration of his life. He was named as a life tenant. He was also named as the measuring life. He was granted ownership of the farm and the house until he what?
Died.
Until he died. And here's the really cool thing about that. Guess what that grantor was able to say in 1943 when she died and had her wishes carried out. And my grandfather, by the way, did not die until 2008. So her wishes were carried out
for 65
years later.
Yeah.
In 2008, when my grandfather died, guess who she named as eventually receiving ownership of that farm and that house when my grandfather, that measuring life died?
His heirs?
The Children's Hospital.
The Children's
Home of North Carolina. The
Oh, wow.
Children's Home of North Carolina. So she wanted it to go to the Children's Home, but she wanted in the meantime it to benefit my grandfather for his lifetime. And she got her wishes. 65 years after she died, she got exactly what she wanted. The house, the farm became the property of the Children's Home of North Carolina. My grandfather benefited from it his entire life. I think it's pretty cool that you can set up things and do things like that with property ownership transfers.
Travis, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Does that end with the children's home now that is in complete ownership of them, or is there anything else that is now it's up to them what happens with it? They can tear it down, rebuild, or sell it, whatever.
The one restriction that was placed has now been satisfied.
Okay.
Right? The one restriction was that my grandfather's ownership would end upon his death. And now that his death has occurred, that restriction has been satisfied. The Children's Home of North Carolina took ownership of the property, fee simple, absolute.
Okay.
And so
So there's no new deed is required.
Oh, there was a deed. There was a deed with my grandfather as the grantor and the Children's Home of North Carolina as the grantee, but it's a function of law. It's automatic. It's not required that it be signed.
Okay, but you still would do the paperwork so it could be, you could follow the chain of title.
That's right. So you have a clear chain of title to show the transfer of ownership. And listen, trust me, when you are one of these people who stands to benefit from a measuring life dying and a life tenant losing ownership, you pay attention. Guess who we got a sympathy card from within 2 days after my grandfather died?
Children's Home.
The Children's Home. That was their way of saying, hey, get out. Ours. They wanted their money.
I think what also helps me remember why this is based on the death of somebody, because I like to know the why, even though sometimes it's not important, is because when somebody died, first of all, if we placed it on a specific time limit, who's going to be watching that every single day and make sure it happens? If it's listed in somebody's will when their will is being
reviewed
and enforced, I don't know what really.
The problem with wills is wills can be changed.
Or I'm sorry, in the deed, if it's in their deed, then what's the word for it or the term that we're doing with the estate?
Probating the estate.
When we're probating the estate, it will be followed out. And it's so significant when somebody dies that it's going to be followed. Whereas if it's just based on a specific time.
And so here's what a life estate allows that grantor to do. Guarantee what they want to happen will happen. Now, let me ask y'all a question. Could she have left that farm to my grandfather, fee simple absolute, and just left a letter that said, hey, I would love for you when you die to leave this to the Children's Home of North Carolina? Could she have taken that approach?
Yes.
Yes. But would that be binding on my grandfather? Would he have been required to do that? No. So she chose the route where he didn't have a choice. She chose the route where she said, I'm going to make sure you give this thing to the Children's Home of North Carolina because I'm going to state it right now when I give it to you. You don't have a choice. Do you all see the benefit of that, right? Now, let me tell you how that might be used outside of situations like that. Let's say, let me give you a hypothetical example. Let's say that you have two people who this is their second marriage, and they both have
Sandra.
Property. Yeah, Sandra, right. And both of them have children from previous marriages. Okay. It is very likely that they would like to have their property ownership transfer to their children, not their new spouse's children who are grown. Is everybody with me on that? You get remarried, you just married your new husband. He's got kids that are in their 20s and 30s. You got kids in their 20s and 30s, but your house that you owned before you married this new person, you want it to go to your kids, not his kids. Is everybody with me how that might be a real concern?
Yes. Oh, wow.
Right? Here's the thing though. You want to make sure you leave the house to your spouse when you die because you want them to be taken care of. The problem is you can't control what they do after you're gone. So if you just leave the house to them when you die, is there any guarantee they're going to leave it to your kids, or might they screw your kids and leave it to their kids when they die?
Right. Oh, yeah.
But could you give it to your spouse as a life estate and name your children as the recipient of that property when your spouse dies?
Correct.
That's why these things matter, folks, because they still have a use. Does that make sense for everybody? Are we kind of picking up why this would be used?
So a life estate. Oh, go ahead.
If they're married, they can only own property as tenants in the entirety. So the new spouse owns part of that property.
That's not true, William.
Not
people that are married are not required to own property as tenancy by the entirety if it's property that they owned prior to the marriage.
Okay, it's just after the marriage.
Tenancy by the entirety, which we're going to talk about later this afternoon, is for property that was purchased while already married.
So don't stress if you don't know it yet. And not just saying you, William, I'm talking to everybody.
Yeah.
But so is it safe to say that a life estate would trump a will?
Yes.
Okay.
Wills can always be changed. People can tell you, I've had people show somebody, oh, I'm going to show you my will. You're in my will. And then they run 5 minutes later and they change the will. And then the person dies and, you know, their daughter thinks they're getting it all. And they find out that he had a little side piece down the road and left it all to them. That happens, folks. Wills can be changed all the time. These things cannot be changed. These deed restrictions are permanent. Once they
pertinent.
That's the benefit of doing it this way. Does everybody see why this is much stronger than simply placing it in a will?
Once you place that restriction, you can't remove it.
That's right. That's right.
So I know also before you get Grant's question, Kayla had one. She had her hand raised, but I accidentally put it down. So she said, quick question, if the woman would not have stated another owner after his grandfather, would it have been taken by the state? And instead of being a life tenant, it would be a fee simple absolute.
So that brings up, Kayla's question brings up exactly where we're headed now. What happens to the property when the measuring life ends? It sets us up for, because here's the thing, can we all agree that the property, the land is not going anywhere? Can we all agree with that? Right?
Yes.
The person, the measuring life may die. And when they do, the life estate comes to an end. But the property itself is going to continue on. And so we need a new owner. And that new owner is going to be dictated by the grantor. One way or another, the grantor, whether they think they've chosen or not, has chosen. Now, in the case of my grandfather's life estate, her name was Miss Bunting. Who did Miss Bunting choose as the new future owner of that property when my grandfather passed away?
Mr. Everett. Oh, sorry.
The children's home, right?
Yes, the children's home.
Children's home of North Carolina. She said, my grandfather will own the property until he dies, and then it goes to where?
The children's home of North Carolina.
The grantor chose that. It was right in the deed that transferred ownership to my grandfather. He owns it until his death, and then ownership will transfer to the children's home of North Carolina. So the grantor chose. What if, and this is Kayla's question, what if the grantor, and y'all need to pay attention here, because what I'm about to say is not confusing, but you're going to make it confusing. Take a deep breath. What if the grantor had not said what happens after the life estate? Well, the property is not going to go away. We still need an owner. Is everybody with me on that?
Will it go back to the grantor, Travis?
It goes right back to the grantor. It reverts back to the person who started this thing. Don't make that more complicated. Stop your brain in its tracks right now. Stop. Let me be clear. Let me say this. I don't give a shit that they're dead. I do not give a shit that they're dead, and you don't either. It's going to revert back to them. And that's, you make it harder than it is. It's going to revert back to the grantor. And what happens to it past that point is really not our concern. Either they had a will and they would follow their will, even if they've been dead for 65 years. Can we still follow their will if they had one? Right? Or if they didn't have a will, what did I mention earlier happens when you die without a will? When I said it was so dangerous for you to die without
North Carolina.
State,
North
go to
Carolina.
the state of North Carolina.
will decide for you, right? The state will decide for you. So in the case of my grandfather's life estate, if she had not said that was going to go to the children's home of North Carolina, ownership would have done what? It would have reverted
back to her or her heirs.
Or her heirs, and you would have gone back to when she died in 1943 and say, okay, did she have any heirs in her will? Did she have a will? If she had heirs, then they would end up with the property. And then this is where you start chasing the rabbit holes. Well, what if they're dead? Well, then we would look at their will. Eventually, aren't we going to find somebody alive?
Yes.
right? Or if she died without a will, who would get to make the decision of what to do with the property?
The state.
The state of North Carolina. That's as simple as it is, right? That's as simple as it is. And I don't want you to overly complicate this in your brain. If the grantor doesn't decide in advance where it goes, it simply reverts back to the grantor. Is everybody okay with that statement?
Yep. Yes.
It's like a boomerang. It just comes right back around to them. Now, most grantors in these situations don't leave it open like that. Most of them name what will happen after the life estate ends. We call that a remainder. So in my grandfather's example, who was the remainder interest?
North Carolina children.
Children's home.
The children's home was the remainder interest. They're the ones who get it in the end, right? That's the remainder interest. So if the grantor just sort of said, so I'm going to give you an example right here. You tell me if I've given you a reversionary interest or a remainder interest. Michael is granted ownership of a home in Wake County until he dies. That's it. That's all I'm saying. Did I give you a remainder interest or did I give you a reversionary interest? Reversionary, because the natural question you would have to ask is, well, what the hell happens to it after Michael dies, right? And if you don't know, then it's a what, Kayla?
Remainder.
It's a reversionary, right? If you don't know, it's reversionary. How about this one? Michelle has been granted ownership of a 400-acre farm in Cabarrus County until Jonas dies, at which time the farm will go to Howard. Did I give you a remainder interest or is that a reversionary interest?
Remainder.
That's a remainder because I gave you a and then it will go to. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes,
someone remains.
Okay. If you know the answer to who remains at the end, then it's a remainder interest. If it's left up in the air, it's reversionary. Does that make sense for everybody?
Okay, Michael has the property until Betty White dies, and then it goes back to Michael.
Michael has the property. Well, it won't go back to Mike. Why wouldn't you just give it to Michael? Michael has the property until Betty.
What I said.
What now?
Michael has the property until Betty White dies, and then it goes back to Michael.
That's not a life estate.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Tell me how.
Because you literally said it's going back to the same person who already had it during the life estate. You got to have a change of ownership. If you're going to name a remainder, then it's got to be different than the life tenant.
I'm not naming a remainder, though. I was just kind of confusing that if they name somebody, maybe not always assume that it is a remainder.
Well, yeah, but what you just said doesn't make sense as a life estate to me. Michael.
Okay. If you know what I'm saying, then can you translate it?
Michael owns the property till Betty White dies. Remainder or reversionary?
Reversionary?
Reversionary. That, I mean, there's no way to, Michael owns the property till Betty White dies and then it goes to Jordana. Remainder or reversionary?
It would be a remainder.
Remainder, right. Anytime there's an and then it goes to, that's a remainder.
So they'll never try to trick them and say like something like that. Okay.
Yeah, they won't. They won't. Now I understand what you were trying to say. I didn't get it for a second, but yeah, they will not try to be tricky with that, thankfully.
Right.
They sure won't. Okay. So look at this. Let's break one apart. It says Sam deeds a home to his sister Tina and specifies that Tina will only own the property until Tina's daughter Tiffany dies. At that point in time, the home will transfer to Sam's best friend, Larry. So let's break it apart. Who's the grantor? Who creates this situation?
Sam.
Sam. Okay. Who's the life tenant? Who did Sam grant ownership to for a limited period of time?
Tiffany.
To who?
Tina.
Tina. Who is the measuring life? In other words, who are we watching?
Tiffany.
Tiffany, right?
Tiffany.
Tiffany's the measuring life. And is this a reversionary interest or is this a remainder interest?
Remainder.
This is a remainder.
Remainder.
Very good.
Right.
And we know it's a remainder because we know it's going to go to somebody in the end, right? We know the end result and they have a name, so that's a remainder.
Larry.
That's Larry. Our Larry is our remainder. How do we all feel about that? Because if you can do that, then you pretty much have got understanding of life estates knocked down. Is that pretty good?
It's very simple. It gets a little bit nitpicky as we learn more stuff in the course. So make sure you just review this and know it.
Okay.
Got it.
Now, there is some terminology I'm going to add in here, but it doesn't change the ideas we just talked about. There's a name for a life estate when the measuring life and the life tenant are the same person. And there's a name for a life estate when they're two different people. So look back over at this one. Measuring life and life tenant, are they the same person or are they two different people?
Two different.
Two different, because the life tenant,
Two different people.
Tina, and the measuring life is who?
A daughter.
Tiffany,
Tiffany.
right? Two different. That has a name. That's called a life estate per ultra V. If they were the same, that would be called a conventional life estate. In a conventional life estate, that just means that the life tenant and the measuring life are the same person. Doesn't have anything to do with the remainder, doesn't have anything to do with the grantor. It's just that the life tenant and the measuring life are exactly the same person. So I've given you an example. Travis owns the property. That's the life tenant, right? Until Travis dies. That's measuring life. Life tenant, measuring life are both the same what?
People.
Same person.
The same person.
If they're the same person, if you've got Travis owns until Travis dies, if that's a match, then it's a conventional life estate. If the life tenant and the measuring life are two different people, then that's a life estate per ultra V. Travis owns, there's the life tenant part, until Leslie dies, not a match. When they don't match, that is called a life estate per ultra V. It's just a naming thing.
It is, and I remember in our previous courses, you had mentioned the exact, what that means in English is for the life of another.
Right, if you translate per ultra V, you're exactly right. If you translate per ultra V from Latin, it means for another's lifetime. It's a life estate for somebody else's lifetime. So y'all help me out here. I don't want to know remainder or reversionary right now. I just want to know,
Conventional.
are we conventional or are we per ultra V? Let's talk about that for a second. I'm gonna make a couple of them up off the top of my head. That's why I took the slide away for a second. I'm gonna go back to it. But I'm gonna make a couple up off the top of my head, and I want you just to tell me, is it conventional or is it per ultra V? Okay, I'm gonna give you more information than you need in a lot of these cases, but I want you to tell me it's conventional or per ultra V. William has been granted ownership of a vacant lot of land until Molly dies, at which time ownership of the property will transition to Elizabeth. So I'm gonna say that.
Per ultra V.
Per ultra V.
That's per ultra V. Because William is the life tenant and Molly is the measuring life. That's per ultra V. Does everybody see that?
Mhm.
Jordana has received ownership of a property she inherited from her grandmother until her death, at which time ownership will transition to Eliza. I'm gonna say it again. Jordana has received ownership of a property from her grandmother until Jordana's death, at which time the ownership will transfer to Eliza. Is that conventional or is that per ultra V?
Conventional.
It's conventional because Jordana owns the property until Jordana dies. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Marcia has purchased a property and she's just discovered that her ownership will terminate upon her own death, and then ownership will transition to the state of North Carolina.
Conventional.
Conventional because it's terminating on her own death, right? Yasser has taken ownership of a property until his youngest child dies. And then ownership of the property will go to the University of North Carolina. That's per Ultra V. Are we all okay on recognizing the differences in those? Good, very good.
You try to trick us in those first two, though.
I do. I'm trying to give you more information than you need. That's exactly right. I'm trying to give you more than you need because that's what they're going to do on the test. Now, what we end up having to do on the test is put all those together because it's like two pieces, right? You've got to first decide, is it conventional or per Ultra V? Then you have to decide, is it remainder or reversionary? Does everybody see what I'm talking about there?
Yes.
So when you look at this one, it says Andrew will own the property until Andrew dies, and then it will go to Karen. Well, Andrew owns the property till Andrew dies. If you take that statement right there, that tells you it is what?
Conventional.
Conventional. And then it will go to Karen. That tells you it is what?
Remainder.
Remainder.
Remainder. Does everybody see how we piece those together?
Yes, sir.
So look at the next one. Seth will own the property until Betsy dies, and then it will go to the University of North Carolina. So is that per Ultra V or conventional? Seth will own the property until Betsy dies. Talk to me about that. Per Ultra V or conventional?
Per Ultra V.
That's per Ultra V. And then it says, then it will go to the University of North Carolina. They are the remainder. So that's a per Ultra V life estate with a remainder interest. How do we all feel about that?
Good.
Okay.
Confident.
Maria or Mariah owns a piece of land until her death. Okay. So Maria owns it until her death. Well, if we take all of that together, that tells us what?
It's conventional.
It's conventional. And then they didn't tell us what happens after that. If they don't tell us what happens after that, it's got to be what?
Reversionary.
Reversionary. If we can't point to the and then statement, then we got to be reversionary. It's reverting back. Simon has inherited a property that he will own until his oldest child dies.
Per Ultra V.
So that's got to be per Ultra V because Simon has inherited a property until his oldest child dies. That's two separate people. There's your per Ultra V part. All right, then what happens?
Reverts. Reversionary.
Reversionary. Tell us what happens, so it must revert. And that's all you're doing, folks, is piecing those things together. That's it. That's it. How do we feel about a life estate?
Pretty
Now,
good.
Remember, those are examples of a grantor who wants to limit time. You know, what was the first type of grantor that we talked about? The type of grantor we wish we always had, the one who doesn't limit anything. What grantor was that?
That was fee simple.
Fee simple.
Or fee simple absolute. They both mean the same thing. It's exactly right. Okay. Now let's talk about the other grantors. The first one we just talked about is a life estate grantor. That's limiting time. Now we want to talk about the last.
Travis.
Yes. Talked about the grantor who wanted to limit time. Now we need to talk about the grantor who wants to limit use. This is going to be a grantor who is not saying you own the property for a limited amount of time. There's not going to be any life tenant here. There's not going to be any measuring life. There's not going to be the, you know, you only own it until Betty White dies. That's not the restriction that the grantor is interested in here. The grantor here is saying you own it as long as you want to. You do whatever in that regard. I don't care. But I want to make sure you know you either must do this with the property or you can't do that with the property. The grantor has a couple of choices here. They can either tell you what you must do with the property, or they can tell you what you cannot do with the property. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell y'all, because a lot of people will get confused here. Most people think they'd rather be told what they can do rather than what they cannot do? No, you would not. You would much rather be told what you cannot do. Let me give you an example. How many of you remember when you were a teenager? Some of you still are. When you were a teenager, which one would you rather hear your mama say? You can go to the movies at 7 o'clock. That's it. 7 o'clock movie. I'm picking you up at 9 o'clock. You better be out front. You go to this movie. You don't go. This is it. That's all you can do, or you stay home. Or would you rather your mom have said to you, I don't want you to go to the skating rink. Whatever else you want to do is fine. Which one would you have rather had your mom say to you?
Bless me that I can't go.
I don't want you to go to the skating rink, because could you have gotten into all kinds of trouble and not broken mom's rules if she let you have anything you wanted other than the skating rink?
Right.
All kinds of trouble.
Right. Whereas somebody who tells you this is it, this is all you can do, that's really strict. So a grantor who is saying this is the only allowable use is a really strict grantor. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that is called fee simple determinable. A grantor who is a fee simple. Now it still has the word fee, so we know it is what? What does that word fee mean?
Ownership.
Inheritable.
Inheritable.
Freehold means ownership. These are all freehold because they're all ownership. This one has that word fee, so that means it's inheritable. Is everybody with me on that?
Mm-hmm.
But fee simple determinable means that the grantor has determined what the property can be used for. Now, here's what you need to understand. The grantor is not just determining what the grantee right now can do with the property. How many owners are going to have to follow that restriction?
All of them.
Every single one in the future. So is it possible for a grantor, as an example, let's say a church comes to me and they want me to donate land to them so that they can build a fellowship hall. Could I grant ownership of that land to the church so long as they only use it for a fellowship hall?
Correct.
Yes.
And if I grant the ownership that way, how long does that property have to be used as a fellowship hall?
Forever.
Forever. Could the church sell it? Sure. If they could find somebody who's willing to buy it and only use it for a what?
Fellowship hall.
Fellowship
Or a
hall.
fellowship hall. Is that going to be really limiting about the property?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. So fee simple determinable is a really, really limiting sort of thing when you're given this really short list of this is what you can do with the property.
Travis, I have a question for you.
Okay, go ahead, Tosh.
When it comes to the fee simple determinable, so say for instance, going back to your example of this property can only be used for a church fellowship hall. Previously, you said that, say for instance, the church closes, and you said that if it was abandoned, then that will automatically go back to the state. The property will automatically go back to the state. When it goes to the state, are all of the what's it called? The appurtenances and all that, do they go away at that moment in time? So can now the state do anything with it?
That's a really specific situation by situation thing. It depends on how ownership ends up getting transferred. In most cases, no. Most times these restrictions stay in place even after something like that. But it just really depends on how ownership is taken. Yeah.
Okay, so the state will still then have to now sell it to a church.
Potentially. Okay. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So now that's fee simple determinable. You could also have a grantor who is not quite, Russell, that's really, that's beyond our scope. And so I'm not going to worry about, if I bought property from the state and what they would put on deed and all that kind of stuff, because it's just so far beyond what we're focused on here. It's a reasonable question if you want to talk about it, outside of class time, but it's too detailed for where we are right now. You could also have a fee simple subject to a condition deed. Fee simple subject to a condition is a grantor who does want to stipulate, but they don't want to stipulate what you can do with the property. They want to stipulate what you cannot do with the property. And so your covenants, as an example, if you think about covenants, aren't covenants really a list of things that you what? You can't do with the property. So covenants would be example of when you are attaching covenants to the property, that'd be an example of a fee simple subject to a condition. Because what you're really saying is, I'll transfer ownership to you of this property as long as you cut your grass, as long as you don't have your trash cans sitting in front of the garage, as long as you don't put a shed in the backyard, whatever those restrictions happen to be, you could. So could it be a whole list of things that couldn't be done?
Yes.
Yes. But as long as you're saying these are the things that cannot be done, then that is fee simple subject to a condition. Ownership is being transferred subject to these conditions. How do we all feel about that?
Yep, got it.
So,
So wait, one second, Trav, sorry, I couldn't find my button. So fee simple subject to a condition is an example of a fee simple defeasible title?
there are both fee simple defeasible. Fee simple determinable and fee simple subject to a condition are examples of fee simple defeasible.
Oh, because they're telling you what to do with the property.
That's correct. Anytime the grantor is placing a restriction based on use, that is called fee simple defeasible. And then there are two categories of fee simple defeasible.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So y'all help me identify which one is which here. Let's see, who do I want to pick on? Pick on somebody I haven't picked on yet. Let's say that Jackie is purchasing a property from Sarah, and Sarah has dictated on Jackie's deed that Jackie may not place a hog farm on the property. Is that an example of a fee simple determinable, or is that an example of a fee simple subject to a condition? So Jackie's purchased a property from Sarah, and Sarah has stated that the property cannot be used as a hog farm. Which one is that? Is that fee simple determinable or fee simple subject to a condition?
Subject to condition.
Subject to.
Conditional.
Subject to a condition. That is subject to a condition. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So Amy is purchasing a property, and the grantor on the deed has stated that Amy must leave the property in its current use for the remainder of time. Fee simple determinable or fee simple subject to a condition?
Fee simple determinable.
Determinable. Good. Very good. And that's all there is about use restrictions. Use restrictions is much shorter than the time restrictions. Life estates takes a lot longer to explain than the use restrictions does. And that takes us through the ways that a grantor can limit things, the ways that a grantor can come in and say, well, we've limited your use or we've limited your time. That actually takes us through the different ways that it can be limited. And almost all of those are inheritable. Almost every single thing that we just talked about is inheritable. Fee simple absolute, which means they're all fee. Fee simple absolute, fee simple determinable, fee simple subject to a condition. Even the life estate per ultra V is inheritable. Y'all ready for a test question? I'm gonna give it to you right here now. It's coming. And the reason I can pretty well predict it's coming is it's the only one. Seth said I was going to tell you about it, and I'm telling you about it right now. There's only one example of ownership that cannot be left as an inheritance. How many did I say there were?
One.
One.
In other words, on a test, there's only one non-fee type of ownership, because fee means what?
Inheritable.
All of the rest of these on this slide are fee. They are inheritable. The one that is not inheritable is the conventional life estate. There is no way to leave a conventional life estate as an inheritance. It cannot be done. You cannot leave a conventional life estate as an inheritance. And if you think about it, folks, that makes all the sense in the world. Here's why. A conventional, when would you leave something as an inheritance? If let's say that, for example, Michelle owns a piece of property. When would she potentially leave that as an inheritance for her heirs?
Her dad.
When she died.
Dies. If she has a conventional life estate, what's going to change when she dies?
Who gets the
She
property?
didn't own it anymore.
Doesn't own it anymore. She can't possibly leave it as an inheritance if she doesn't what?
Own it.
Own
Own
it.
it.
She doesn't own it.
So a conventional life estate is not inheritable. That's the one. That's the one. How are we? Talk to me.
God, okay.
Yeah. Folks, that's all of the ownership. That takes care of ownership. The only ones left are the non-freehold. What do we say freehold meant?
Ownership.
Ownership.
Ownership. So what does non-freehold mean?
Lease.
Mostly,
Rent, lease.
Lease, rent,
right?
not owner.
Not owner. That's right, not owner. So when we talk about non-freehold estates, there's 4 categories of them. And honestly, it's going to be mostly like a vocabulary experience for you. They are really simple to differentiate if you will keep them simple. When it comes to leases, when it comes to non-freehold estates, they can be broken into 4 categories: tenancy for years, periodic tenancy, tenancy at will, or tenancy at sufferance. Those are the 4 categories of non-freehold estates or leasehold estates. It really, simply put, just broken into those 4 categories. And I'm going to tell you very simply, and I think Seth will tell you the same thing. This is one of those ones where people make it a lot harder than it has to be. There's a very easy way to tell them apart, and it has to do with how the lease ends. Not how the lease works when the person's staying there. We don't care about how long they've been there. We don't care about if it's residential. We don't care about if it's commercial. We care about how the lease is going to end. Is everybody with me on that? Okay. So when we're breaking down leases or non-freehold estates, we're going to talk about the way the lease ends. It's all about how the tenant vacates the property. Do they give notice? Is there a requirement that the tenant give notice? Is there a requirement that the landlord give the tenant notice? That's going to be the big differentiator of these non-freehold estates. And we're going to quickly finish these, and then that'll be our lunch break. So this is the last thing we got before we get to a lunch break today. But it's a simple differentiation for you, because when it comes to leases, some leases require notice and some don't. Most of you have at some point rented a residential property. How many of you have rented a residential property in North Carolina? If you think about your lease when you rented that residential property, was there any mention at all on that lease of the word notice, like giving notice to vacate the property? Was that anywhere on the lease? What do y'all think?
Yes, typically 30-day notice.
It is a very common statement, but it does not have to be there. Folks, if that statement is there, it's called a periodic tenancy. If there is any statement at all about the tenant's got to give 30 days notice, the landlord's got to give 60 days notice, if either party has to give notice to the other party, it is called a periodic tenancy. I want you to say that out loud so you hear your own voice say it. If the lease requires notice, it is periodic. Say it.
If the lease requires notice, it is periodic.
It's periodic.
If the lease doesn't mention notice, it's not periodic. It is that simple. So any lease where a tenant has to tell the landlord, oh, hey, I'm planning to move out. What kind of lease is that?
Periodic tenancy.
That's a periodic tenancy. If the tenant has to tell the landlord they're moving out, that's a periodic tenancy. Any lease where the landlord has to tell the tenant, look, we're not renewing your lease is up, but then where they have to tell the tenant is what kind of a lease?
Periodic.
Periodic. That's what notice means. Anytime they have to communicate with each other and let them know what we plan to do. Do we plan to stay or do we plan to go? That is giving notice. And if the lease requires the giving of notice, it is a periodic tenancy. Is everybody good with me on that?
Yes.
And here's the interesting thing about a periodic tenancy. If you don't give notice, what does it say that periodic tenancy is going to do?
Automatically renew.
Automatically renew. In other words, you're not giving notice that you intend to renew. What are you giving notice for in a periodic tenancy?
Vacate or
Terminate.
Vacate the property. You give notice to vacate. Any lease that says anything about giving notice to vacate the property, you need to give your, how many of you have heard people say, oh, I have to give my landlord 30 days notice before I move out? What kind of
Very
lease?
common.
What kind of lease do they have?
Periodic.
They have a periodic tenancy. When you get a letter in the mail from your landlord that says, well, it's now 60 days before your lease expires, we need to know what you're planning to do. Are you planning to renew? You plan to move out? What kind of lease is that?
Periodic.
Because what they're doing is giving each other notice. Is everybody clear on that?
Yes.
The opposite of a periodic tenancy is something called the estate or tenancy for years. Now, don't get hung up on the 4 years part. An estate for years is any lease that doesn't require what?
Notice.
Notice. If the lease doesn't mention notice, it is an estate for years. If the lease does mention notice, it's a what?
Periodic.
So listen, I'm going to test you out right here. I mean, I feel like you're ready for the final exam. I'm going to just go ahead and give you the final exam question right now. Tia has leased a home at Atlantic Beach for 2 weeks. That's it. That's all I'm going to say. Tia has leased a home in Atlantic Beach for 2 weeks. Periodic tenancy, or does she have an estate for years?
Estate for years.
Estate for years.
She has an
Estate for
estate
years.
for years.
Estate for years.
Those of you that said periodic, pick up the heaviest thing you can find and drop it on your toe. Because I did not say the word what?
Notice.
Notice to
Don't
terminate.
make it hard. If I didn't say notice, it's not what?
Periodic.
Periodic.
See what I mean? If you can't get a periodic question right, you're being idiotic. Because seriously, it has to say the word notice. Don't make that harder than it is. Marcia has rented a property for the next 16 years, and she has to give at least 5 years of notice to the landlord. What kind of lease does she have?
Periodic.
It has nothing to do with the period of time. It has to do with the word what?
Notice.
Notice. Mandy has leased a cell phone tower for the next 72 years.
Tenancy for a
Tenancy
estate.
estate.
For years.
Tenancy for years or estate for years, because it didn't say anything about what?
Giving
Notice.
Giving notice. Now, for your reference, the estate for years is much more common in commercial leasing. The periodic tenancy is much more common in residential leasing. Most commercial leases, folks, don't require the tenant to give what before they move out?
Notice.
If you have a 5-year lease on a commercial space, nobody expects you to give the landlord notice that you're moving out. It's just understood that at the end of 5 years, you'll be what?
You got out.
You'll be gone. It's understood. See, I call the periodic tenancy the baby version of leasing. We got to hold your hand. Hey, darling, your lease expires in 30 days. Now, honey, what do you want to do? And see, we got to hold those residential tenants' hands because they forget. They're not responsible. And so that's why you do periodic tenancy in residential leases. Does that make sense for everybody? Because it would be a disaster if you just showed up at somebody's house and said, you were supposed to be out yesterday. Wouldn't that be sort of crazy to expect somebody to just drop everything and move out of their house because they forgot their lease was expiring?
Yep.
So you want to give that person a lease that says you have to give them what?
Notice.
Notice. That's the periodic tenancy. The one where you don't want notice, that's in estate for years. Are we all good at it, identifying the difference between those two?
Yep.
So now, the third one is called the estate at will. The estate at will is one that has no beginning and no end. The estate at will is one where there's no commitment by either party. How long has the tenant promised they will stay?
Can be
They
forever.
haven't specified.
They haven't
haven't
promised they'll
promised.
stay at all. How long has the landlord promised that the tenant can stay?
Hasn't promised anything.
They haven't promised anything. It's essentially, you can stay until I change my mind.
Right.
And when I do change my mind, you gotta what?
Go.
You gotta
Go.
leave. Now, here's the thing though, it's a non-commitment both ways. The landlord's not making a commitment to the tenant, but the tenant's also not making a commitment to the what?
To the landlord.
To the landlord. So here, let me give you an example of this. Let's say, as an example, my mom and her sister own my late grandparents' house. And I know some of y'all probably got some family that falls in this category. Any of you got that cousin that just can't get themselves right? They just, you know, this whole life thing just ain't working out for them.
I got a brother like that.
Right, well, there you go, right? We all got those people in our life. My late grandparents' house was built in the 1800s. It is one of those places that you couldn't heat it if you set it on fire. It's old. It's not, you would not want to live there, you know? We can't really rent it out, but at the same time, it's perfectly safe to live in. It's fine. So my mom and her sister just let their cousin stay there. They're like, listen, if you just cut the grass and do some, just whatever, just stay there. Here's the thing though. Could the cousin move out tomorrow without telling them, without letting them know? Would that be fine?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Could my mom and her sister show up tomorrow and say, get out, I'm done. We're done with this.
Yes.
Yes.
That's an estate at will. At will means no commitment from either party. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
It does.
Okay. So if there's any sort of time commitment at all, it's not going to be at will. At will just literally means whatever, it's fine. Stay there if you want to. I don't care. That's at will. It's just permission to be there. Everybody all right with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So most people, if they let their kid move back into the house, would you say that's a periodic tenancy? For most people, if you let your kid move back into the house and stay with you, would you say that's a periodic tenancy? Would you say that's an estate for years, or would you say that's an estate at will for most people?
Estate at will.
Estate at will.
Estate at will.
It's an estate at will for most
Yep.
people. Yep. Good. Good.
And so essentially it's just permission to stay in the property. Is that what you already mentioned?
That's right. Temporary permission to stay with no guarantees. That's
Mhm.
exactly right. And then finally, you don't have permission to be in the property. The estate at sufferance. This is 1/2 step better than trespassing. Let me tell you why this is a 1/2 step better than trespassing. This is a person who at one point did have permission to be there. This is your kid who moved back into the basement with your permission, but you have told them to do what?
Leave.
Get out.
Get a job.
Get a job and get out of my house, and you come home and they're still what?
There. Eating.
There.
Still
Couch.
there. They are there.
Eating your food.
They are there at sufferance. And we use this anytime a tenant has overstayed their legal right to be in the property, but they still will not voluntarily leave. We also refer to them sometimes as a holdover tenant. So this would be somebody whose lease expired at the end of last month and you still can't get them to leave the property. The legal terminology for them is they have an estate at sufferance. The key thing to recognize here is you have to go through the eviction process with that person. You cannot just call the police. You can call the police on a trespasser. If somebody never had your permission, if you just come home and somebody's sitting on your front porch, you call the police. If you come home and your kid is still there who had your permission but now does not, you can call the police, but the police are not going to do anything. They're going to say you got to take them to court and do what with them?
Evict them.
You got to evict them because they are a tenant at sufferance. That's the difference between them and a trespasser.
Is that kind of what went on with COVID and the
Yes, all of the with the COVID eviction moratorium, those are all tenants at sufferance now, because they've been asked to leave by the landlord. They've refused to leave, but the landlords don't have the right to evict them because there's been a moratorium placed on the eviction. Those are all tenants at sufferance at this point. Yep. Sure are. How do we feel about those 4 categories?
Got it.
Sierra asked, do you get 30 days for an estate at will? No, an estate at will, you don't get any time period, because anytime you start to put a time period on it, that's a promise, right? An estate at will has no promises at all, okay? So I'm gonna just throw some out there real quick randomly, and I want you to, and I'm just kind of making these up, and I want you to talk to me about what you think it is. Let's say that Howard has leased a property for the next 2 years, and the lease requires he or the landlord to give 30 days written notice if they plan not to renew.
Periodic
Periodic.
tenancy.
That's a periodic tenancy. Nisha has leased a vacation property on Atlantic Beach for the next 2 months through VRBO.
Estate for years.
Tenancy for years, yeah.
That's an estate for years. Yep. Grant has a tenant who leased his home, his investment home in Carborough for the last 3 years. The tenant has been a fantastic tenant, but they've fallen behind on their rent, and their lease has ended. Grant has given them notice to leave and asked them to leave, but they have refused to do so. This is an
Estate at sufferance.
estate at sufferance. And Aaron has gotten permission from a property owner to live in the property until it's torn down due to eminent domain.
Tenancy at will.
Estate at will.
Estate at will. There you go. There you go. You got those mastered. You got those mastered.
It's remembering it all. That's the question.
It is. It is for sure. It is for sure. But I want to show you all something before we take our lunch break. Y'all remember that chart right there? Remember how like completely intimidating it was when I threw it up there the first time?
Yes.
We've now covered every single one of them. We've now covered all of that. Those are all of the potential estates. Those are all of the legal relationships that a person could have to a piece of property that we talk about in the class. And that I will tell you that as a unit is a
Hold on, Travis, can you put that back up, please?
Oh, sure. That's a lot of really in-depth thinking for people, as you know, as a block of information. And so you know, you should congratulate yourself because you're hanging in there and you're answering those questions and you're staying with it. And it's that this is not easy information. And Seth is adding some little notes there, right? The freehold stuff is the ownership stuff. The non-freehold stuff is non-ownership or leases, right? And then you've got permanent types of ownership and temporary types of ownership. So, but it's a really, really big chunk of information, and you all hung in there, and I'm thankful for it. So good job. Good job. Y'all ready for lunch?
Of
Good.
course.
All right. So let me go ahead and stop the recording here.
Hold on.